a few seconds, you will hear the rain sound. I know you're searching for a tiny bit of quiet in a world that never stops talking. You can close your eyes now. For a second, the dashcam caught two glowing amber eyes sitting deep in the roadside ditch. But as the headlights hit them directly, there was no body, just a lingering, tragic soul floating above the weeds. I can feel that spirit inside my car now, sharing their story and giving me goosebumps. But you are completely safe here. As I am hearing this rain while driving, no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. The modern world runs on a rapid-fire rhythm that keeps our brains frantic, but stories heal. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we begin, if these videos help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you left a like or subscribed, or just wrote something small in the comments. Even a single word. It helps other tired people find their way here too. Now, let us begin. Hey, come sit with me for a while. Whatever today cost you, you can put it down now, right here, for as long as you need. You have done enough. All I am asking of you tonight is that you let yourself be carried somewhere that is not your own life for a little while. The story I have for you is a quiet one, and a dark one, and I want you settled before I begin. Villisca, Loa, in the flat farm country of the southwestern part of the state, where the land holds no hills to stop the wind, and a person can watch weather arrive from 2 counties away. There is a square of cloth I keep in a drawer I never open. It is not evidence. It was never evidence. I took it because I could not stand the thought of anyone else finding it first, and because some nights I still cannot decide whether I saved it, or whether it let me take it. Good evening. What I am about to tell you happened in a house that still stands, in a town most people cannot point to on a map, and it is going to ask something of you that most stories do not. It is going to ask you to sit with an ending that was never given to anyone. Get comfortable. This one takes its time. My name does not matter for the next hour. What matters is that for 6 years I was the person who unlocked the door of the Moore House in Villisca, Loa, after the last of the daytime visitors had gone home, and let the overnight guests in for the thing they had paid to feel. I want to tell you, before anything else happens in this story, that I was good at my job. I was better at it than almost anyone who has ever done it. I could stand in the children's bedroom at midnight and describe, without a tremor in my voice, the exact angle at which the axe had come down. And I could do it while a grown man beside me quietly began to cry, and I would put a hand on his shoulder and tell him he was allowed to leave any time he wanted, and he never once did. That was the whole trick of the job. You did not scare people. You built a room so completely that people scared themselves inside it, and you stood there calm enough that they trusted your calm more than their own instincts. I had not thought, until the year I am telling you about, that this might be a dangerous thing to be good at. The house sits on a corner lot with a porch that catches the last of the evening light, and from the road it looks like nothing at all, which is the first thing that unsettles anyone who already knows what happened there. In the summer of 1912, a family named Moore, along with 2 young guests staying the night, were killed in their beds with an axe that belonged to the property. 8 people. No one was ever convicted, though a man was tried twice and acquitted both times, and the case has stayed open, on paper, for over a century. The killer before leaving, did one thing that the reports still cannot explain. He covered every mirror in the house and every window with cloth pulled from the family's own linens and clothing. Nothing was broken to get in. Nothing was stolen. He stayed for some time in the dark with the bodies and did this quiet, careful domestic thing, and then he walked out into the night and was never found. The Liska itself does not advertise what happened there. You will not find the house on the town's welcome sign, and the diner on Main Street does not sell postcards of it, though every waitress in the place will tell you exactly how to find it, if you ask quietly enough. The town holds the house the way a family holds a relative. Nobody discusses at dinner, present, known, occasionally mentioned in passing, never looked at directly. I have always found that restraint more unsettling than any ghost story could be on its own. A community that has spent over a century declining to explain itself is a community that has made peace with a gap the rest of us have not. I had read every version of that story 100 times before I ever answered the ad for a caretaker. I told myself, the way you do, that the reason I wanted the job was curiosity, or an interest in history, or a love of a good ghost story. And all three of those things were true, and none of them were the whole truth. The whole truth I did not look at directly for 6 years, and I am only looking at it now because of what happened on the night I am about to describe. I want to tell you about my sister first, because you will need her before the end, even though for a long time I told this story without her in it at all. Her name was Callie. She was 17 when she died, in a house fire, in a home I was supposed to be watching her inside of while our parents were away for a weekend. I was 19. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the television on, and by the time the smoke reached me, the hallway to her room was already gone, and there was nothing anyone, including the firefighters who arrived 11 minutes later, could have done. I know this because I have been told it by professionals more times than I can count, in the calm, practiced voice of people whose job it is to tell grieving 19-year-olds that they are not to blame. I believed them in the way you believe a fact you have memorized without ever letting it settle into your body. Somewhere underneath that belief, a smaller and much older part of me has spent 22 years certain that if I had simply been a different, more vigilant kind of person, my sister would still be alive. For years after Callie died, I could not sleep in a house without checking every outlet twice before bed, without lying awake calculating how many seconds it would take me to reach a window if I needed to. I moved 4 times in my 20s. Each new apartment chosen partly for its fire escapes, and each time the calculating followed me anyway, because the thing I was actually afraid of had never been fire. It had been my own unreliability. It had been the terrible, private knowledge that when it mattered most, I had simply been asleep, and that no amount of vigilance afterward could undo the one night I had not managed it. I did not go looking for a job that let me stand inside someone else's unstoppable tragedy every night and reassure frightened strangers that nothing could have been done. I only ever wanted to sit with people in the dark and tell them, convincingly, that some horrors arrive regardless of what anyone does. I understand now that I needed to hear that as much as any guest ever did. I understand now that I built an entire professional skill out of the sentence I could never say to myself. That is the part of me the house found. I am telling you this now, out of order, because a story like this only makes sense once you know what was already standing in the doorway before anything supernatural ever arrived. On the night in question, I had 3 overnight guests booked, which was a light group by our summer standards. 2 of them were a middle-aged couple from Nebraska who had done this kind of tour before, in other haunted places, and treated the whole evening the way some people treat a roller coaster, as a thrill they had already priced correctly. The third was a young woman named Priya, traveling alone, who told me in the driveway before we went in that she had read about the house for years and needed, for reasons she did not explain further, to spend one night inside it. I want you to notice, the way I did not notice at the time, that I liked her immediately, and that liking her did not make me more careful. It made me perform more warmly for her. I gave her the version of the tour I gave to people I wanted to protect, full of the small human details that make the dead feel like people instead of a headline, and I watched her listen to all of it, with her arms wrapped around herself, and I told myself I was doing my job well. The evening went the way most evenings there go. We toured the rooms by flashlight before dark, and I gave the history the way I always did, plain and unhurried, letting the facts do the work instead of my voice. I have told this story enough times to know that the truth needs no help from me. The children's room where 4 of the victims died still holds an afternoon chill, even in July, a temperature difference every guest notices, without my mentioning it first. I let them notice it themselves. That is a caretaker's trick, too. Silence sells better than narration. The Nebraska couple found their own small moment of unease. Before 9, the kind that comes and goes without changing anyone's evening. The husbands setting up their sleeping bags in the downstairs bedroom called out that the closet door kept drifting open no matter how many times he shut it, and his wife laughed and told him the whole building was probably a few degrees off level after 100 and some years of settling. I stood in the hallway and offered the same explanation myself, and it was, as far as I know, entirely true. Old houses breathe, doors drift. I have given that reassurance so many times that it no longer feels like a guess to me. It feels like a fact I own. I want you to remember that confidence, because it is the exact confidence that failed me a few hours later, in a smaller room with a much less reasonable door. I checked on all 3 guests once more before I settled into the kitchen for the night, moving room to room with my flashlight low the way I always do, more out of habit than expectation. Priya was sitting on the edge of the bed in the main upstairs room, with her knees pulled up. And when I asked if she was doing all right, she said yes, in a voice that did not quite match the word. I noted it the way I note most things guests say in that house after dark, filed it under ordinary nerves, and went back downstairs. I have thought about that exchange more than almost anything else from that night. I had all the information I needed to worry properly, and instead I filed it. The way you file a piece of paper you plan to deal with later, and then do not. Somewhere around 10 in the evening, while the Nebraska couple set up sleeping bags in what had been the parents' room downstairs, I made myself a cup of coffee in the small kitchen we use as an office, and I sat for a moment with both hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the heat come up through the ceramic, while it slowly stopped being worth drinking. It is a small thing, and I only mention it because I remember it so clearly. The warmth going out of that mug while I filled out the guest logbook, the house quiet around me in the particular way it gets quiet once the daylight visitors are gone, and only the people willing to stay the night remain. I remember thinking, with no sense of anything wrong yet, that I was glad to be inside, and that the coffee had gone cold faster than it should have. I did not think anything else of it. I want you to hold on to that moment, because everything after it moved faster than I was prepared for. And that stillness was the last hour of the night that felt entirely ordinary. Priya found me around 11, standing in the kitchen doorway in a way that told me, before she said a word, that something had already shifted for her. Her voice, when she spoke, was very even, the way voices go when a person is working hard to keep them that way. So, well, she said, and stopped, and started again. There is a smell in the small room upstairs, the one off the girl's bedroom. It was not there an hour ago. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because it is the center of everything that follows. I did not go check the smell myself, not right away. I gave her the script. I told her that older houses breathe with the temperature, that a pantry room sealed for a century will hold odors that release without warning, that this was, in fact, one of the more common things guests reported, and almost always had an explanation rooted in the building's age rather than anything else. I said all of this gently, and I said it well because I had said some version of it perhaps 1,000 times before to 1,000 other frightened people, and every one of those 1,000 times it had been true. She nodded, the way people do when they want to believe you more than they actually do, and went back upstairs. I sat with my coffee a while longer after she left, and I want to describe that cup to you, because it is the last soft thing in this story before everything else. The mug had gone lukewarm in my hands, the way it always does when I lose track of time, filling out logbooks. And there was something almost comforting in that ordinary failure of temperature, proof that at least one small process in the world was still behaving exactly the way it was supposed to. I remember thinking, with no weight to the thought at all, that I should microwave it, and then not doing so, and simply holding the mug instead, feeling the last of its warmth go out through my palms while the house ticked and settled around me the way it always does. I did not know yet that I was storing up the memory of an ordinary comfort I would want back very badly before the night was over. It was another 40 minutes before I went up myself, and I want you to understand that in those 40 minutes, nothing loud happened. No cries, no crashes, nothing that would have justified rushing. What happened instead was smaller and, looking back, worse. I sat in the kitchen finishing paperwork, and every few minutes I found myself glancing at the stairwell, and each time some small, well-trained part of my mind supplied the reassurance before I had even fully formed the worry. That is just the house settling, it said, in my own voice, the voice I used on strangers. I had been telling myself that for 6 years. I was very good at believing it. At one point, I caught myself pressing my palm flat against the kitchen table, hard enough that the wood left a mark in my skin, and I could not have told you why I had done it, or how long I had been doing it. My mouth had gone dry sometime in the last several minutes without my noticing, and when I finally stood up to climb the stairs, my own footsteps sounded strange to me, too loud in one moment and swallowed entirely in the next. The way sound behaves in a room that has stopped being only a room. I told myself this was fatigue. I have told 100 guests the same thing about their own racing hearts. So I told it to myself and believed it exactly as well as they usually do, which is to say, not at all, underneath the words. When I finally climbed the stairs, the temperature on the second floor had dropped in a way that had nothing to do with any pantry breathing loose a century-old odor. I felt it first along my arms, a lifting of hair I did not consciously register, until I noticed my own skin had gone cold enough to ache, and only then did the smell reach me, a sourness under the smell of old wood, faint enough that I could have told myself, and briefly did tell myself, that it was nothing at all. I found the small room off the girl's bedroom with its door standing open, and Priya was not inside it. Her flashlight lay on the floor of the main bedroom, still lit, its beam pointed at nothing, and for one full second, standing in that doorway, I felt something come up through the floor of my chest that I had not felt in 22 years. A specific, physical certainty that I had again arrived too late to stop something I should have stopped sooner. The flashlight on the floor threw its beam sideways across the ceiling, catching nothing, illuminating nothing. Simply proof that Priya had been standing exactly where I now stood and was no longer there. I felt the hair along my arms lift before my mind had finished the thought that something was wrong, my body arriving at the fact several full seconds ahead of my understanding of it, the way it sometimes does when you are already reaching for a falling glass before you have registered that you knocked it. My vision seemed to narrow at its edges, the way it does at the top of a long fall. Everything outside the doorway going soft and distant, while the doorway itself sharpened into the only thing that existed. I called her name. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and steadier than I felt, because steadiness is the only thing I have ever known how to offer anyone in a moment like that, including, apparently, myself. She answered from inside the small room, her voice muffled in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind understood why. "The door," she said. "It will not open. I do not know how I got in here. I was standing right here, and then I was in here. I want to tell you what that little room looks like, because it matters. It is barely large enough for a grown adult to turn around in, original to the house, used at the time of the murders for storage. There is a single small window in it, high on the wall, the kind meant for airflow rather than light. I do not remember deciding to cross the bedroom toward that door. I remember only that my hand was already on the knob, my arm already extended, before any part of me had consciously chosen to move, the way a body sometimes acts a half-second ahead of the mind that is supposed to be steering it. When I pulled, the door came open without resistance, without a stuck latch or a swollen frame, or any explanation at all for why it had held a moment before, and Priya came out into my arms, shaking, hard enough that I could feel it through both our coats. Here is where the mind does something strange, the same something it always does when the real thing has finally arrived, and there is nowhere left to put it. I told myself, standing there with a 19-year-old's fear, finally reaching the surface of a 41-year-old body, that I needed to remember to check whether I had locked the gift shop register before we came upstairs. It is a ridiculous thing to think in that moment, and I have talked to enough guests over the years to know it is not an unusual one. The mind will reach for the nearest small, solvable worry rather than hold the large, unsolvable one. even a second longer than it must. I stood there thinking about a cash drawer, while a woman I had promised safety to shook against my shoulder, and some part of me understood, distantly, that this was not calm. This was hiding. It was only once I looked past her, into the little room, that I saw the window. A square of pale cloth had been pressed against the glass from the inside, held there by nothing I could find afterward. No tack, no tape, no explanation the house's owners or I have ever been able to offer to anyone who asks. It matched in weave and in age nothing in the building's current inventory. It matched as closely as anything I have ever seen with my own eyes. The description given in the original 1912 investigation of the cloth found over every other window in that house. On the night 8 people never left it. I did not sleep that night, and neither did anyone else in the house. And by morning Priya had already called a car to take her to the bus station, rather than wait for the shuttle we normally arranged. She did not ask for a refund. She did not want to talk about it further. She wanted, understandably, only to be somewhere else, and I have thought about her more times in the years since than I can count, wondering whether she has found a way to put that room down, the way I have spent 22 years failing to put down a hallway I never even saw catch fire. I kept the cloth. I want to be honest about why, because it took me months to understand it myself. I did not keep it as evidence, though I told the house's owner it was for exactly that reason. I kept it because some old, unexamined part of me recognized the shape of what it meant before the rest of me caught up. A cloth pressed over glass from the inside does not keep anything out. It keeps something from looking through to what is on the other side. In 1912, whoever did what was done in that house apparently could not bear the thought of the world seeing in, or perhaps could not bear the thought of what was inside being able to see a way out. I have read every theory anyone has offered for that detail over 100 years, and none of them agree. And I no longer think agreement was ever the point. I think the covering was never about hiding the house from the world. I think it was about making sure that whatever remained inside those rooms stayed exactly where it was, tethered to the glass it could no longer see through, unable to follow anyone who managed to walk out the door. For months afterward, the house went back to feeling like the house I had always known, ordinary in daylight, quietly heavy after dark, nothing more than what it had always been. I told myself the cloth in the little room had been some elaborate misunderstanding, a scrap left behind by a previous caretaker, a coincidence, dressed up by 2 frightened people at 1 in the morning into something it was never meant to be. I told this to Priya once, over the phone, weeks later, when she called to ask whether anything else had happened since. I told it to myself far more often than I told it to her, and I said it in the same warm, certain voice I had always used. And I am ashamed now of how easily I still trusted that voice, even after everything. I found a second square of that same cloth 8 months later, pinned to the mirror above my own bathroom sink at home, in a house 40 minutes from Veliska that no guest of ours has ever set foot inside. I have not told the house's owner about that one. I have not told Priya. I am telling you now, because I finally understand what it was doing there, and because understanding it is the only thing that has let me sleep since. For 6 years I told every frightened guest in that building the same comforting lie I had first told myself at 19. Some things arrive regardless of what anyone does. Some horrors cannot be stopped by vigilance, only endured. I believed I was offering people mercy. I understand now that what I was actually doing, every single time, was rehearsing my own oldest excuse until it sounded like wisdom. I built a career out of the sentence I needed someone to say to me the night my sister died. And I said it so often, to so many strangers, in a house already full of people it had failed to save, that something in that house recognized the shape of what I was carrying long before I ever admitted it to myself. I do not think the house wanted to hurt me. I have turned that thought over more times than I can count, lying awake with a small drawer 3 feet from my bed. I think it wanted, in whatever patient and wordless way a place like that can want anything, for me to stop performing an ending I had never actually earned. I think it offered Priya's fear to me not as a punishment, but as a mirror, close enough and cold enough that I could no longer mistake my calm for courage. I still work at the house. I want you to know that, because I think it matters more than any of the frightening details I have given you tonight. I still stand in that children's room with a flashlight, and I still tell the story exactly as it happened, without softening it, without offering anyone the comfort of an explanation the facts do not support. But I no longer tell frightened guests that nothing could have been done. I no longer know with the certainty I used to fake so well whether that is true for anyone, including myself. What I tell them now, when someone stands in that doorway shaking, is only this: I am not going anywhere. I will stay here in the dark with you for as long as you need, and I will not pretend to know more than I do about what is standing on the other side of that window. I keep the cloth from my own bathroom mirror in the same drawer as the one from the little room upstairs. I have never told anyone why I cannot bring myself to throw either one away. I think some part of me understands, finally, after 22 years, that a person can spend her whole life covering a window so carefully that she forgets she was never the one meant to be kept inside the room. I think the house only ever wanted me to notice that the cloth had been on the wrong side of the glass the entire time. I drove out to see my parents a few weeks after I found the second piece of cloth, something I had not done in longer than I want to admit, and I sat with my mother in her kitchen and finally said Callie's name out loud without following it immediately, with an explanation of why nothing could have been done. My mother did not offer me the explanation either, which surprised me more than anything else that year. She only reached across the table and held my hand, and we sat like that for a long time, not fixing anything, not resolving anything. Simply two people who had both spent over 2 decades performing a calm neither of us had ever actually felt. I am still deciding what to do with any of it. Some nights I open the drawer and look at both pieces of cloth for a long time before I close it again. I have not decided if that is grief or penance or simply the last honest thing I have left of my sister. I suspect it may always be all three at once, and I have stopped waiting for that to change. What I have stopped doing, at least, is telling frightened people in the dark that nothing could have been done. I no longer know if that is true, and I think I am finally strong enough to let it stay unknown. There is a word I have spent my whole career teaching people not to be frightened of. And I have never once, in all that teaching, managed to convince myself. I tell every visitor the same responsible, careful explanation. I have never told any of them that I once watched someone go looking for a better one and never come back. Good evening. I want to tell you about a word before I tell you about a person, because the word is older, and because it is the reason I still cannot walk certain stretches of coastal marsh after dark without my chest going tight. In the late 1580s, a colony of more than 100 English settlers established themselves on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, the first attempt at a permanent English foothold in the New World. Their governor sailed back to England for supplies, was delayed for 3 years by a war he had no control over, and returned to find the settlement entirely empty, not destroyed, not looted by force, dismantled, carefully, as though the colonists had taken the time to disassemble their own homes before leaving, carrying away what they could carry, and abandoning only what they could not. I have walked the reconstructed footprint of that palisade more times than I can count, and there is something about its careful, unhurried dismantling that has always unsettled me more than any account of violence could have. Violence, at least, would have offered a reason. On a post near the entrance, someone had carved a single word, Croatoan, the name of a neighboring island and the people who lived there. The colonists had agreed, before the governor ever left, that if they were forced to relocate, they would leave word of their destination carved somewhere visible, and a cross if that move had happened under duress. There was no cross, only the word, calm and deliberate, exactly as promised. A single act of trust left behind for someone they believed would eventually come looking. The governor never reached that island. A storm and a lost anchor turned his ships back before he could follow the one clue his own colonists had left specifically so that he could find them. And no verified trace of any of those 100 and some people has ever been recovered in the more than 4 centuries since. I have built my entire professional life around that unresolved distance, the space between a clue that should have solved everything and an answer that never arrived to close it. I am a public historian at a coastal heritage center, not far from where that colony once stood, and my job, more than anything else, is discipline. Visitors come to me wanting the dramatic version, the curse, the vanishing, the word that some corners of local folklore have spent centuries treating as an omen rather than a location. I meet perhaps 30 of them a day in the busy season, families and school groups, and the occasional serious enthusiast, and every one of them arrives already half in love with the mystery, hungry for the version of this story that resists explanation. I do not give them that version. I give them the responsible one, the archaeological one, the theory best supported by evidence, that the colonists most likely relocated peacefully and assimilated over time into the Croatoan people and other nearby communities. A far more mundane conclusion than the ghost stories prefer. And, as far as the evidence allows me to say, almost certainly the true one. I did not always hold that discipline as tightly as I do now. I want to tell you about a woman named Odalys Ferrer, a research colleague, and, for a few years, one of my closest friends, who came to the center 4 years ago, full of a very different kind of certainty. Odalys did not believe the assimilation theory told the whole story. She had spent years developing an alternative reading of the colonists' final weeks, built around a small, disputed set of local landmarks and oral tradition, she believed, toward a specific stretch of tidal marsh several miles from the main excavation sites, a location she was convinced held physical evidence no one had ever properly searched. She used to describe it to me in the break room after hours, spreading old survey maps across the table, tracing a route with one finger while she talked. And I remember, in those early years, finding her certainty almost contagious, the particular energy of someone who believes she is standing closer to an answer than anyone else in the field has ever stood. I want to be honest that her theory was not, on its own merits, unreasonable. It was ambitious and thinly supported, and exactly the kind of claim that a responsible historian is professionally obligated to treat with more caution than enthusiasm. And I gave it exactly that caution, publicly and repeatedly, in meetings and peer review, in the quiet, increasingly strained conversations we had outside of work as her fixation deepened. I watched the change happen gradually. The easy, collaborative energy of those early break-room conversations narrowing over 2 or 3 years into something more solitary, more defensive, a woman who had stopped bringing her ideas to be tested and started simply protecting them instead. I told her, more than once, in language I chose carefully, because I believed it to be true and professionally necessary, that a historian's responsibility is to the evidence that exists, not to the story a person wants that evidence to tell. I remember one particular conversation in her final autumn with us, when she brought a new set of survey coordinates to a department meeting, and I, in front of 3 colleagues, walked through each of her supporting citations aloud, pointing out where the evidence thinned and the inference began, watching her jaw tighten with every sentence until she finally gathered her papers and left the room without a word. I told myself, afterward, that I had done nothing wrong, that rigor delivered publicly was still rigor, and I still believe that was true. I have never been able to fully forgive myself, all the same, for the specific look on her face as she walked out. I watched her grow more isolated within our small department, as her theory failed again and again to gain institutional support, and I want to admit now, plainly, that some part of my own caution was never entirely separable from a simple, unscientific unease I could never fully explain to her, a feeling that had nothing to do with peer-reviewed methodology and everything to do with a cold, wordless instinct that told me the specific stretch of marsh she kept returning to was not a place I wanted either of us walking into alone. I did not tell her that. I told her, instead, the responsible thing, the disciplined thing, and I watched her stop bringing her research to me at all sometime in her 3rd year at the center. Odalys went missing on a Tuesday in early October 4 years ago, having told no one where she intended to go. I remember the specific, ordinary way that day began. A department meeting she skipped without explanation, a text I sent her by mid-afternoon that went unanswered, the particular low-grade worry that builds slowly over the course of a day, rather than announcing itself all at once. By evening, when her landlord confirmed she had not returned home the previous night either, that low-grade worry had become something else entirely. Her car was found the following morning, parked at a small unmarked pull-off along the causeway, nearest the marsh she had spent years insisting on, doors unlocked, her field notebook still on the passenger seat. open to a page of coordinates and a single underlined phrase that the search team later photographed, and that I have never been able to stop thinking about since. Close enough now. I could always feel it. I have read those 5 words more times than I could count, turning them over in every possible tone, wondering whether they were the words of someone finally vindicated, or someone already past the point of being able to turn back. The search continued for 11 days across difficult, waterlogged terrain that swallowed footprints within hours of being made. I joined the volunteer search line on 4 of those days myself, wading through cord grass taller than my own shoulders, calling her name into a silence that never once answered back. And I remember, on the last of those days, standing at the exact edge of the search perimeter, where the terrain became too unstable to continue, staring into ground that simply refused to hold a boot print long enough to tell anyone anything. No trace of her was ever recovered. I want to tell you what happened to me in the year that followed, because it is the part of this story that has changed the way I do this work more than any single artifact or excavation ever has. I did not stop giving visitors the responsible, careful version of the colony's disappearance. I want you to understand that clearly. I still believe, as strongly as I ever have, that a public historian's obligation is to evidence rather than appetite, and that the assimilation theory remains, by every reasonable measure, the account best supported by what we actually know. But I no longer deliver that explanation the way I once did, with the flat, comfortable certainty of someone who believes caution alone is sufficient protection against whatever a person might actually find if they went looking hard enough in the wrong direction. This past spring, a young graduate researcher named Priya Anand joined our department for a summer fellowship, and within her first 2 weeks, I watched her begin asking the exact questions Odylus had once asked, following, without ever having read Odylus's unpublished notes, an eerily similar thread toward the same disputed stretch of marsh. She had come to the fellowship with her own independent interest in the region's oral histories, entirely unaware of Odylus's work, and I remember the particular cold vertigo of watching her lay out a set of local landmarks on the same break room table, where Odylus had once done exactly the same thing, tracing a nearly identical route with one finger while she talked. I felt something move through me the first time she showed me her working notes, a cold, immediate recognition that had nothing to do with the quality of her research and everything to do with the specific remembered shape of a fixation I had watched consume someone else. My hands, I noticed, had gone still on the edge of the table in a way that had nothing to do with calm. I did not dismiss her the way I once dismissed Odylus. I want you to understand that this is the only thing I did differently, and it is the only thing that mattered. I sat with Priya for an entire evening, going through her notes page by page, giving her every piece of professional caution I genuinely believed. And then, when I had finished being the historian, I told her the rest, plainly, as a person rather than an institution. I told her about Odylus. I told her about the coordinates in that notebook, and the phrase underlined twice, and the 11 days of searching that found nothing at all. I watched her face change while I spoke, the easy academic excitement she had walked in with giving way to something more sober, more careful. And I remember feeling, for the first time in 4 years, that I had finally managed to give someone the whole truth, instead of only the responsible half of it. I told her that I did not know, and would likely never know, whether that marsh held an answer or simply a danger dressed convincingly as one, and that either possibility was reason enough for her never to go there alone. She listened to all of it in a way Odalus, in her final year with us, had stopped being able to listen to anything I said. When she asked several weeks later whether I would accompany her on a properly resourced, fully permitted survey of that same stretch of marsh, daylight only, a full team, radios checked twice before we left the causeway, I said yes. I will tell you honestly that I have never been more frightened in my professional life. Then I was walking that ground alongside 4 other researchers in broad daylight, cordgrass pressing close on either side of a boardwalk, built specifically for the survey, every one of us aware, without needing to say it aloud, of exactly whose absence had made this particular expedition necessary. I remember the specific quality of that morning's light. Flat and gray under a low ceiling of cloud, the marsh around us alive with the small, constant sounds of birds and insects that somehow made the silence beneath them feel more pronounced rather than less. My own hands stayed cold inside my gloves the entire walk in, despite a temperature that did not remotely justify it, and I found myself, more than once, glancing back over my shoulder toward the boardwalk behind us, checking, without quite admitting to myself what I was checking for, that it was still there. We found nothing that day that solved anything, no bodies, no colonial artifacts, nothing that could be entered into any official record as evidence of what happened to Odalus or to the 100 colonists who came centuries before her. What we found, near the exact coordinates in her notebook, was a scatter of old, unremarkable stones that had at some point been arranged into a rough, deliberate line, weathered enough that no one on our team could confidently date them, pointing, if a person wanted to read them that way, further inland, toward ground none of us had permission or provisions to survey that day. I crouched beside that line of stones for a long while, longer than the rest of the team, running my gloved fingers along their weathered edges, feeling the particular, deliberate spacing between each one, a spacing too even to be entirely accidental, and too worn to be entirely recent. I do not know what Odalise found before whatever happened to her happened. I do not know if those stones are evidence of anything at all, or simply the kind of pattern a frightened, grieving mind is always eager to assemble out of nothing. I know only that I did not let Priya go looking any further that day, that I made the call to end the survey before dusk, watching the light begin to flatten and gray toward evening, in a way that made the decision feel less like caution and more like simple, urgent instinct, and that I have scheduled a second, larger expedition for this coming spring, with permits, with a full team, with every piece of institutional caution I have spent my career believing in, because I no longer think caution and curiosity have to stand on opposite sides of a person, the way I once, disastrously, believed they did. I still give visitors the responsible version of this story, every single day. I still believe it is the truest account the evidence allows. But I tell it differently now, standing at the edge of that old Palisade site, with a group of strangers, watching their faces while I explain the assimilation theory in careful, measured language, and I have started ending every telling with something I never used to say. I tell them that mystery is not the same thing as invitation, that not knowing an answer is not the same thing as being owed the right to go find it alone, and that the single word carved into that post 400 years ago was never a dare. It was an act of trust, left by people who believed, right up until the moment they vanished, that someone who loved them enough would eventually come looking carefully together and find them. I think of Odalus every time I say it, standing at that palisade with the marsh grass moving somewhere just out of sight beyond the tree line. And I think, too, of Priya, who is finishing her fellowship this month and has already asked to join the spring survey team, rather than simply hand her notes off to someone else. I said yes to that request as well. I have come to believe that the actual lesson 4 centuries of an unanswered word has to teach is not that some mysteries deserve to stay buried, but that no one should ever have to go looking for the truth entirely alone. And I intend to spend the rest of my career making certain that no one working alongside me ever has to again. There is a folder in my office I have not closed the drawer on all the way in 3 years, because some part of me needs to be able to open it in the dark without fumbling, and some part of me is still deciding whether that is preparation or superstition. Inside it is a name I am almost certain of, and almost has never once in this work been enough. Good evening. I want to tell you about a case first, because you will need it before anything else in this story makes sense. In 1970, in a remote valley outside Bergen, Norway, a hiker found the burned body of a woman among the rocks, dressed in clothing whose every label had been cut away by hand, surrounded by wigs and disguises, and at least 8 separate false identities she had used to check into hotels across the country over the preceding year. She had wiped her own fingerprints from glasses after every meal. No passport was ever recovered. She died from a combination of sleeping pills and carbon monoxide, and investigators have spent more than 50 years disagreeing about whether that death was suicide, accident, or murder. What no one has ever disagreed about is this. Someone spent a year of their life making absolutely certain that if they died, no one would be able to prove who they had been. And to this day, more than half a century later, they have succeeded. I have built an entire career around that case, though I do not work in Norway, and I never touched that file professionally. I am a forensic genetic genealogist, which means my job on paper is to give unidentified remains their names back, using DNA and public genealogy databases to trace a body forward into a family tree until a name finally surfaces. It is quieter work than people expect when I describe it. Mostly spreadsheets and family trees, and long afternoons cross-referencing marriage records in county archives. And I have always found something almost peaceful in that quiet, a kind of patience the work demands that most of the rest of my life does not. What that job actually requires of me, underneath the science, is something closer to a discipline of refusal. Families call my office every week, believing they have found their missing person in some cold case file. And my entire professional value lies in telling most of them, gently and precisely, that they have not, that a shared surname or a similar age or a familiar-sounding scar is not evidence, And that hope, however badly earned, is not the same thing as proof. I did not always understand how important that discipline was. Early in my career, I identified a Jane Doe found in the foothills east of Yakima as a young woman who had gone missing 11 years earlier, based on a genealogy match that felt, at the time, close enough. I remember the phone call I made to that family myself, my voice full of a warmth I had not yet learned to be suspicious of in myself, the particular satisfaction of being the person who finally closes a decade of not knowing. Her family buried her, held a funeral, closed a wound that had been open for over a decade. And for a long while afterward, I kept a small card the mother had sent me, thanking me for giving her daughter back, tucked into the corner of my desk drawer as proof that the work I did mattered. 6 years later, a fuller DNA panel run for an unrelated case revealed that I had been wrong. The Jane Doe was someone else entirely, a woman with no genealogical connection to that family at all, and the daughter they had grieved for 17 years was, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine since, still simply missing. I still have that card in a drawer somewhere, though I have not looked at it in years, and I do not think I ever will again. I was not the only person responsible for that error, and I have been told this so many times by so many well-meaning colleagues that I can recite the sentence in my sleep. I have never once believed it, the way I believe almost everything else in my life. I built the entire architecture of my professional rigor afterward, brick by brick, specifically so that I would never again mistake a comfortable answer for a true one. That discipline is the reason the state handed me the Cascade Doe file 2 years ago, a case that had sat unsolved and largely untouched since the body was found by hunters in 1989, burned beyond recognition in a remote fold of forest an hour outside the nearest town, dressed in clothing with every label cut away by hand, a French-made wig found nearby, no identification of any kind. I drove out to that stretch of forest myself. The first week I had the file, though there was nothing left to see there after so many years, only timber and undergrowth and the particular gray stillness the Cascades hold long past noon in late autumn. Mist sitting low in the trees in a way that made the whole hillside feel like it was holding its breath. I stood there for a long while, longer than any actual investigative purpose required, trying to imagine a woman choosing that specific remote fold of land to disappear inside of, and I could not, even with everything I would later learn, ever fully answer for myself why she had chosen it. The similarities to the Norwegian case were close enough that the 2 junior analysts who first flagged the file to me had actually cited it in their notes, half joking, calling her our own Isdal woman, before anyone told them to stop. I did not think it was a joke. I have never thought it was a joke. I spent 2 years on that file the way I spend every file, refusing every lead that felt merely plausible, chasing down distant genealogical branches with a patience that even my own supervisor once called excessive. And I want to tell you honestly that the excessiveness was never really about the Cascade Doe. It was about a young woman in Yakima who is still, as far as anyone knows, still missing, and about a family who buried the wrong grief for 6 years because someone in my position once wanted to be finished more than she wanted to be right. 8 months ago, a DNA match came back from a public genealogy database that I did not expect and did not, at first, know what to do with. I remember the evening it arrived clearly, a Tuesday, my office quiet, except for the hum of the building's heating system. A mug of tea beside my keyboard that had long since gone cold while I worked through a backlog of unrelated matches. I almost did not open the notification until morning, the way I almost never do, and I have wondered since what might have been different if I had let it wait, though I do not think, in the end, that it would have changed anything. It connected the Cascade Doe, not to some distant stranger's family tree, the way these matches almost always do, but to my own. A second cousin, once removed, a relation close enough that I sat at my desk for a long while simply staring at the screen, running the numbers again, certain I had made some elementary error I would find within minutes. I ran the analysis a third time, then a fourth, the tea beside me going from warm to cold to something I no longer registered as a beverage at all, and each pass returned the same answer with the same flat, indifferent certainty that data always carries, entirely unmoved by how much I did not want it to be true. I did not find an error. Whoever the Cascade Doe had been in life, she shared blood with a branch of my own family that had, according to the records I could find, quietly stopped appearing in any documentation at all, sometime in the late 1970s. A gap in the family tree I had never once noticed, because no one in my family had ever mentioned there was anything there to notice. I called my mother that night, later than I should have, and asked her, as carefully as I could manage, whether she remembered a great aunt on her father's side, a woman who might have left the family, or been asked to leave, sometime before I was born. There was a silence on the line long enough that I understood, before she said a single word, that the silence itself was an answer. I could hear her moving in her kitchen, the particular clink of a cabinet door, a stalling gesture I recognized, because it is one I use myself when a client asks me a question I am not ready to answer, honestly. She told me, finally, that there had been a woman, a great aunt, named Marguerite, who had left under circumstances the family did not discuss, sometime in the mid-1970s, and that my grandmother had forbidden anyone from ever raising the subject again, a prohibition so thoroughly obeyed that my mother herself knew almost nothing beyond the bare fact that the woman had existed and had gone. She asked me, before we hung up, why I wanted to know, and I told her only that it was for a work matter, a small, ordinary lie that sat uneasily with me for days afterward. The first time in my professional life I had ever withheld the truth from someone asking me a direct question about the dead. I want to tell you what happened over the following months, because it is the part of this story where the careful, procedural version of me and the frightened, personal version of me stop being separable from each other. I spent weeks after that phone call searching every public record I could find for any trace of Marguerite after the mid-1970s, and I want to be honest that the search itself began to feel different from any other case file I had ever worked. Less like an investigation and more like an excavation of something my own family had spent decades deliberately burying. County property records showed nothing. Employment records showed nothing. A single library microfilm archive in a neighboring county turned up a newspaper clipping from 1976, a brief notice about a woman matching her description who had been seen boarding a bus out of the area, though the clipping named no destination and offered no further detail, as if even the local paper had understood without being told that this was not a story anyone wanted followed. I built out the genealogical case the way I would for any file, methodically, refusing to let the personal stakes push me toward a conclusion faster than the evidence could support it. And every single test I ran brought me closer to a match I did not want to be true. Somewhere in that process, small things began happening around my own house that I could not immediately account for. And I want to describe them to you the way I would describe them in a case file, plainly, without embellishment, 'cause embellishing them would betray the very discipline this story is actually about. The first was a car I did not recognize, a dark sedan I had never seen on my street before, parked at the far end near the stop sign for 3 consecutive evenings, gone each time before I could get close enough to note a plate. I told myself the first night that it belonged to a visitor at a neighbor's house. I told myself the second night that I was allowing an unremarkable coincidence to take up more space in my thinking than it deserved. A lesson I have spent my entire career teaching to other people. By the third night, standing at my own front window with the porch light off so I could see out without being seen, I no longer fully believed either explanation, though I still did not act on the feeling. Because acting on a feeling with no evidence behind it is the exact mistake my whole career has been built around, never making again. The second was a manila envelope left in my mailbox with no postage and no return address, containing a single photocopied page from an old church registry. My great-aunt Marguerite's baptismal record, with no note attached explaining who had sent it or why. I sat at my kitchen table with that page for the better part of an hour, turning it over as though the blank back of it might eventually offer an explanation. The front never would, my tea beside me going cold in exactly the way it always does. When a piece of a case reaches somewhere in me, the work is not supposed to reach. The third came on the night I finally confirmed, past any reasonable doubt, that the Cascade Doe and my great-aunt Marguerite were, in fact, the same woman. My phone rang at 11 at night from a blocked number, and when I answered, there was several seconds of open, breathing silence before the line disconnected. I sat very still afterward, my laptop still open in front of me, the confirmation email from the lab still glowing on the screen, and I understood with a clarity I did not want that whatever I had just proven true on paper had somehow already been known, and possibly resented, by someone else long before the science ever caught up to it. I felt something that night I had not let myself feel in the 2 years I spent on that file. A specific, physical fear that had nothing to do with the science I trust more than almost anything else in my life. My hands, I remember, were shaking badly enough that I set my coffee mug down before I spilled it, the liquid inside already gone cold from an hour of sitting forgotten beside my laptop while I cross-referenced records. I told myself, in the voice I use on grieving families every week, that a wrong number and an unmarked envelope did not constitute evidence of anything. That I was, in fact, doing to myself exactly what I refuse to let clients do to their own hope. Building a narrative out of coincidence because the alternative, an actual unresolved threat connected to my own family, was too large to hold comfortably. I want to tell you about the night, 3 weeks later, when that discipline very nearly cost me everything. I had arranged to meet a woman named Colette Whitfield, a records clerk at the county archive who had reached out after hearing, through channels I still do not fully understand, that I was researching my great-aunt Marguerite. Her call came to my office line rather than my cell, which I noted at the time, and then, characteristically, set aside as an unremarkable detail rather than a meaningful one. Her voice on the phone was pleasant and unhurried, the voice of someone entirely comfortable with paperwork and dust, and long afternoons among old filing cabinets, and she spoke with the specific, easy familiarity of the archive itself that made her claim to work there feel, at the time, entirely beyond questioning. She told me over the phone that she had documents relevant to the case, materials from the original 1989 investigation that had never made it into the official file, and she asked me to come to the archive after hours, when she would have proper access to the restricted storage room. I want you to notice, the way I did not notice clearly enough that night, that everything about this request should have registered as unusual to someone whose entire career depends on distrusting things that feel too convenient. A records clerk with unsolicited access to sealed materials, a meeting scheduled for after hours rather than during the working day. An offer that arrived at the precise moment I most badly wanted an answer handed to me, rather than earned through my own slow, careful methods. I went anyway, because the professional part of me needed to see the documents before I could believe they existed, and because, I think now, some smaller and much less rational part of me simply wanted, after 2 years of relentless caution, to finally be given an answer without having to fight for it. The archive building was empty when I arrived, a converted county records office on the edge of town, its windows dark, except for a single lit office at the back. I let myself in through a door that Colette had told me she would leave unlocked, and I made my way down a long corridor of shelving toward that lit room, my footsteps swallowed almost entirely by the dense, papered quiet of a building built to hold silence. I remember the particular smell of that corridor, old paper and dust and something colder underneath it that I could not immediately name. And I remember feeling the hair along my arms lift well before I reached the doorway, a sensation I filed, out of long habit, as nothing more than the building's poor climate control. My mouth had gone dry by the time I was halfway down that corridor, and I noticed my own footsteps had slowed without my deciding to slow them, my body apparently less convinced by my explanations than my mind was. The office at the back was empty. A single desk lamp burned over a stack of folders, and there was no sign of Colette Whitfield anywhere in the room. No coat, no bag, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all that evening, except the lamp itself and the folders it illuminated. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, my mind reaching, the way it always does in a stressful instant, for something small and solvable to hold, instead of the larger question in front of me, wondering absurdly whether I had left my car unlocked in the lot outside. I did not let myself finish that thought before I noticed, on top of the folder stack, a single sheet of paper that had not been there in any of the case materials I had ever seen before, a photocopy of a handwritten note, the handwriting unmistakably my great-aunt Marguerite's, matched against samples I had spent months studying. I stepped closer to the desk before I had consciously decided to move, the same way you sometimes find your hand already reaching for a phone that has not yet finished ringing, and I remember the specific narrowing quality my vision took on in that moment, the lamp and the desk and the single sheet of paper sharpening into the only things that existed, while the rest of the room fell away into a kind of gray static at the edges of my sight. The note was addressed, impossibly to me, by name, dated only weeks earlier. I do not fully know what I read in the next several seconds, because my mind, I think, refused for a moment to process it in order, snagging instead on fragments, my own name in handwriting from a woman who had been dead for 36 years. A date recent enough to have been written after I had already begun my search. I remember my body moving before my thoughts had caught up to it, my hand already closing around the edge of the desk to steady myself, my legs already carrying me backward toward the door I had come in through, the decision to leave arriving in my muscles a full second before it arrived anywhere I could call a decision. I made it to my car and locked the doors before I let myself look at the note again on my phone. A photograph I had taken without remembering taking it. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, with the engine running and the heater blasting warm air. I could not feel through the cold that had settled into me, checking my mirrors more times than the empty lot in front of me could possibly justify, before I finally trusted myself enough to drive. I do not remember most of that drive home. I remember only pulling into my own driveway and sitting there a second time, engine off, unable to make myself go inside until I had called a friend simply to hear another human voice say something ordinary back to me. I want to tell you honestly that I still do not know who wrote it, or when, or how it came to be sitting on that desk in an empty building I had been specifically invited into. County records confirmed the following week that no employee named Colette Whitfield had ever worked there. I filed a report. I do not know, to this day, whether the person behind that call and that note is someone still connected to whatever my great-aunt was running from in 1975, or someone else entirely. Drawn to the case the way certain people are always drawn to unresolved things, and I have had to make a kind of peace with not knowing. The same peace I ask grieving families to make every week, though I understand now, far better than I once did, exactly how much that peace costs. I completed the identification. Marguerite Aldous Renner, born in 1941, is no longer a doe file in a state archive. She has a headstone now, in a small cemetery outside Yakima, paid for by a family that includes me, and I visit it more often than I have told anyone. Sitting for a while in the quiet the way you might sit with a relative you never had the chance to actually know. I have not learned, and do not expect I ever will, what she was running from in 1975, or who she believed might come looking for her, or why. Some of the records I would need to answer those questions do not exist, and others, I suspect, were destroyed deliberately, by her or by someone else, decades before I was ever assigned the file. I still do genealogy work for the Unidentified Persons Unit, and I still refuse to name a body until the evidence leaves no honest room for doubt, because I still believe, more than I believe almost anything else, that certainty matters more than speed. I have thought often, since that night in the archive, about the specific kind of courage it must have taken my great-aunt to spend a year of her life erasing herself so thoroughly that even her own family let her go without a fight. And I have wondered whether the same instinct that made her so difficult to find is the instinct I inherited, in a smaller and safer form, as a woman who spends her days demanding proof before she will let herself believe anything at all. But I understand something now I did not understand 2 years ago. I understand that the same discipline that keeps me from harming a grieving family with a premature answer can also, in the wrong moment, keep me standing too long in a doorway, waiting for proof that something dangerous has already found me. I do not know how to fully reconcile those two truths. Some nights, working late in an office with the drawer of my great-aunt's file not quite closed, I catch myself listening for a car outside that is almost certainly not there, and I let myself, just for a moment, believe the feeling before I look for the proof. Before he walked out of that tent, in his socks, into wind that would kill him inside of an hour, the last thing my client said to me was that the tent was not ours anymore. I have explained that sentence to an inquiry board, to his family, and to myself more times than I can count, and every explanation I have ever given has been true, and none of them, not one, has ever felt like the whole answer. Good evening. I want to tell you about a phenomenon before I tell you about a person, because you will need the phenomenon first, and because it is real, and because I have built an entire career on explaining it convincingly to people who are frightened enough to need convincing. In extreme cold, the human body sometimes does something called paradoxical undressing. As hypothermia progresses far enough, the blood vessels near the skin, which have been constricted for hours to protect the body's core, can suddenly and catastrophically fail, flooding the skin with warm blood all at once. The dying brain interprets this flood of warmth as unbearable heat, and a person freezing to death in their final and most confused minutes will often begin removing their own clothing, convinced they are burning up. Search and rescue teams find bodies half undressed in snowbanks with some regularity, not because anything supernatural has happened to them, but because the human nervous system, at the very end, tells its owner exactly the wrong thing at exactly the worst possible moment. I have stood over more than one recovery site in my career, where a seasoned outdoorsman, someone who had survived worse conditions a dozen times before, was found in nothing but a base layer, coat, gloves, and boots discarded in a neat, deliberate trail leading backward toward where they had started, as though some final misguided part of them had been trying to help. I explain this phenomenon to every single client I take into the backcountry, plainly and without embellishment, standing in a parking lot or a trailhead lodge with a whiteboard and a marker, because a client who understands that their own body might eventually lie to them is a client who will trust the protocol I have trained into them over whatever their own dying instincts might otherwise tell them to do. It is, in a strange way, the single most important thing I teach. Do not trust the feeling. Trust the plan. I want to tell you about the night I stopped fully believing that myself. 2 winters ago, I led a group of 4 clients into the Wind River Range on a 5-day winter mountaineering course, a standard itinerary I had run perhaps 30 times without serious incident. One of those clients was a 34-year-old man named Marcus Feld, an experienced hiker with several summer ascents behind him, but no real winter mountaineering. The kind of client I take on carefully, watching a little more closely than the others, though nothing in his behavior over the first 3 days gave me any particular reason for concern. He was, if anything, one of the more conscientious clients I have guided, meticulous about his layering, quick to ask questions rather than assume he already understood an instruction. The kind of person whose caution usually makes a guide's job easier rather than harder. On the fourth night, a storm moved in faster than the forecast had predicted, dropping temperatures to nearly 30 below with wind chill by midnight. We were camped in a protected basin below the tree line, well-sighted, well-provisioned, and everything by the book. I remember checking on the group around 11. The wind already loud enough against the tent fabric that I had to raise my voice to be heard, finding all four of them settled in their bags, Marcus included, and going back to my own tent, reassured in the particular, practiced way that 6 years of guiding had taught me to be reassured. Sometime after 2 in the morning, one of the other clients woke me, shouting that Marcus was gone. I remember the specific, disorienting speed of that waking, going from deep sleep to standing outside my own tent in full storm gear inside of perhaps 90 seconds, my body moving through the drills before my mind had fully caught up to why it needed to. I found the inner wall of his tent cut open with his own pocket knife, a long, deliberate slit rather than a tear. His boots and his parka both still inside, untouched, exactly where he had set them before bed. His sleeping bag lay open beside them, and I remember standing there for a moment with my headlamp shaking slightly in my hand, some part of me refusing to believe what the scene in front of me was so plainly showing. We found him 40 minutes later, 300 meters from camp, in his socks and base layer, already gone, his outer clothing scattered behind him across the snow in a rough line, as though he had been shedding it piece by piece as he ran. I want to tell you that I have not been able to stop picturing that line of clothing since. A base layer shirt, then a thermal top, then a single glove, spaced out across the snow like a trail someone had left on purpose for another person to follow. The inquiry that followed ruled his death an accident, hypothermia-induced confusion, likely triggered by an early and unusually rapid onset of cold injury that produced disorientation before the paradoxical undressing phase even fully began. I testified to that, finding myself, and every word I gave the board was true, and I have never once, in the 2 years since, been able to make that truth feel complete. Here is the piece I did not include in that testimony, because I did not know, at the time, how to say it in a way that would not sound like exactly the kind of unscientific speculation my entire profession depends on me never producing. Before the other client woke, in the last ordinary moment I ever spoke with Marcus Feld, he had asked to speak with me privately outside my tent, close to midnight, his voice low and oddly formal, a register I had not heard from him in 3 previous days of easy, joking conversation. He told me the tent did not feel like his anymore. He said it twice, the second time, more urgently than the first, and when I asked him what he meant, he said only that something about the shape of the space had changed while he slept, though he could not explain what, and that he did not think he could go back inside it. I remember the wind picking up behind him as he said it, snapping the loose fabric of his tent's rainfly hard enough that we both flinched. And I remember thinking, in the moment, that the timing of that gust was simply an unfortunate coincidence rather than anything worth noting. I gave him the explanation I give everyone. I told him the cold plays tricks on unfamiliar bodies, that spatial disorientation is common in the early stages of hypothermia, even before a person feels physically cold, that the safest thing he could do was get back inside his sleeping bag and let me monitor him through the night. He nodded and thanked me in a voice that sounded, for just a moment, relieved to have been given permission to believe me, and went back inside. And I went back to my own tent believing completely that I had done my job correctly. I do not know, even now, whether I had. I did not lead another winter expedition into that range for over a year. I spent that year guiding easier terrain, summer trips, and short-day courses closer to town, telling myself and everyone who asked that I simply needed a change of pace, though anyone who knew me well enough understood what I was actually avoiding. I went to the inquiry hearings alone, sat through each session, with my hands folded in my lap, answered every question precisely and without embellishment, and drove home each night to an apartment that felt, for months afterward, too quiet in a way I could not entirely account for. When I finally agreed to take a new group back in this past January, I told myself it was time, that avoiding the range indefinitely would only calcify a fear I needed to work through professionally rather than carry forever. I spent longer than usual preparing for that trip, rechecking every piece of equipment twice, rereading the incident report from 2 winters earlier until I had memorized it as thoroughly as I had once memorized Marcus Feld's own gear list, as though enough diligence now could somehow reach backward and fix what diligence had failed to prevent then. I did not tell my new clients about Marcus Feld. I want to be honest that this omission sat uneasily with me from the very first briefing, and that I justified it to myself the same way I have justified every difficult silence in this line of work, that some information serves a client's safety, and some information only serves the guide's own need to be understood. The new group was smaller, 3 clients this time, and among them was a woman named Priya Anand, careful and quietly observant in a way that reminded me, more than I wanted it to, of my own training instincts on a good day. She had asked, during our initial gear check at the trailhead, more detailed questions about cold injury protocols than any client I had guided in years, and I remember feeling, at the time, a small, private relief at being paired with someone who seemed to take the mountain as seriously as I needed her to. The first 2 nights passed without incident, clear skies, hard cold, the ordinary rhythm of a well-run expedition, the kind of quiet, competent trip that usually restores rather than tests a guide's confidence. I remember standing outside my tent on the second night, looking up at a sky so full of stars it seemed almost artificial, and allowing myself, for the first time in over a year, to feel something close to the simple pleasure I used to take in this work, before Marcus Feld's name became a permanent fixture in the back of my mind. On our 3rd night out, in a basin not far from where we had camped 2 winters before, close enough that I recognized the particular shape of the ridgeline above us, before I let myself admit why the recognition unsettled me. She came to find me after the others had settled, her voice low in the same careful way Marcus Feld's had once been. She told me the tent felt wrong. Not cold, not cramped, not any of the ordinary discomforts of a long expedition, but wrong in a way she could not name, as though the space inside it had changed shape while she was not paying attention. She apologized for the vagueness of it, even as she said it. laughing a little at herself in the particular, self-conscious way people do when they are describing something they suspect will not be taken seriously. And I remember reassuring her, in my most professional voice, that there was nothing at all foolish about paying close attention to a feeling like that, even as I quietly categorized it, in my own mind, as nothing more than an unfamiliar sleeper's ordinary unease. I felt something move through me in that moment that I recognize now, looking back, as the first real crack in the confidence I had spent 2 years rebuilding. A cold drop along my arms that had nothing to do with the actual temperature outside. I gave her the same explanation I had given Marcus. I heard myself say it, word for word: spatial disorientation, unfamiliar cold. The brain's early confusion before the body catches up to what it is actually experiencing. And I want to tell you that some part of me, even as I said it, understood I was reciting a script, rather than genuinely reassuring her, the way you sometimes catch yourself performing a familiar gesture with your body, has stopped believing in. I sat up much later than usual that night, in my own tent, a thermos of tea gone cold in my hands, while I told myself, over and over, that this was simply what my job required of me now. A heightened vigilance, born of one bad outcome rather than any actual pattern repeating itself. I remember noticing, almost with relief, that I needed to remember to check the group's water filter in the morning, before it froze solid overnight. A small, ordinary task that gave my mind somewhere manageable to rest for a few minutes, rather than sitting inside the larger thing I did not yet have words for. Somewhere in that long, quiet stretch of trying to reassure myself, I noticed my own hands had gone still around the thermos in a way that did not feel like calm so much as it felt like waiting. Around 1 in the morning, I heard movement outside and stepped out into cold sharp enough to take the breath out of my chest, to find Priya standing several meters from her tent, barefoot in the snow, her parka and boots left behind inside. She was not running. Not yet, only standing very still, facing the dark tree line at the edge of the basin, her breath rising in short, even clouds that did not match the stillness of the rest of her body. I called her name once, quietly, the way you might call to someone standing near an edge, and when she did not answer, I called it again, louder, and felt something in my own chest tighten hard enough that I had to consciously remember to keep breathing myself. She turned toward me slowly, said, in a voice far too calm for the cold she was standing in, that the tent was not theirs anymore, and that she needed to find whoever it actually belonged to. I want to tell you what happened in my own body in the several seconds after she said that, because it is the center of everything I am telling you tonight. I felt my vision narrow, the whole wide, dark basin collapsing down to the single small distance between us, and I felt my legs already moving toward her before any conscious decision to move had fully formed. My training reasserting itself the way training is supposed to, faster than fear. Faster than the small, cold part of my mind that had already recognized the exact shape of a night I had lived through once before, and did not believe this time I could survive watching again. I reached her before she had taken more than a few steps toward the trees, and I did not reason with her, and I did not explain hypothermia to her. And I did not do a single thing my professional training has ever taught me to do in that moment. I put both arms around her, bodily, and I half carried, half dragged her back toward the tents, shouting for the other 2 clients to wake and help me. And I did not let go of her Not once. Not even when she began to fight me with a strength that had nothing to do with a rational, conscious decision to resist rescue. We got her inside a sleeping bag, wrapped between two other bodies for warmth, and I sat with her through the rest of that night, with a satellite phone in my hand, watching her slowly come back into herself as the core rewarming took hold. Watching the strange, distant calm in her face give way, gradually, to an ordinary frightened confusion that felt, for the first time in hours, like an actual human being returning to her own body. The other two clients took turns holding her hands and talking to her in low, steady voices about nothing in particular, their own children, a television show one of them had been watching before the trip, the kind of ordinary chatter that has no purpose except to remind a frightened nervous system that it is still attached to the world. I sat near the tent flap with the phone open in my lap, watching the storm outside settle slowly toward morning, running through, again and again, the exact sequence of decisions that had gotten us to that point. Searching for the moment I should have caught something sooner, and not finding one, which frightened me almost as much as the night itself had. By first light, her color had returned and her speech had steadied, and when the rescue team's helicopter finally reached us at mid-morning, she was able to walk to it under her own power, wrapped in 2 extra layers, asking the kind of practical, oriented questions that told me, better than any vital sign could, that whatever had taken hold of her in the night had fully released its grip. She does not remember standing outside the tent. She remembers going to sleep, and she remembers waking up wrapped in blankets between 2 strangers, with a guide's tears freezing on her own face, and nothing at all in between. I have not told her what she said to me in the snow, and I do not know if I ever will, because I am still not certain, even now, whether telling her would be an act of honesty or simply another kind of harm. I want to tell you what I think happened, though. I want to be honest that I do not fully trust my own thinking on this, given everything I have just told you about the limits of my own explanations. I do not believe, even now, in anything I could call supernatural. I believe the body, under specific and poorly understood conditions of extreme cold and isolation, can produce a kind of confusion that our science has not yet fully mapped, a confusion that apparently, in at least 2 documented instances I have now personally witnessed, expresses itself as the same specific, articulate sentence, delivered with the same strange calm by 2 people who had no way of knowing the other had ever said it. I looked afterward at the only case I have ever heard of that resembles what happened to Marcus Feld, and to Priya Anand closely enough to matter, an expedition of 9 experienced hikers in the Ural Mountains in 1959, who cut their way out of their own tent in the middle of the night and ran into a blizzard without their boots, for reasons that were never established then or since. I read everything I could find about that case in the weeks after we came off the mountain. The same way, I imagine, a person newly diagnosed with something rare seeks out anyone else who has ever survived it, searching less for an answer than for the simple, steadying knowledge that the shape of the thing has happened to someone else before. I found photographs of that group, taken in the days before their deaths. Ordinary young people laughing at a campfire, and I found the official verdict that closed their file. A phrase translated across languages and decades that still manages to say almost nothing at all. An unknown, compelling force. I understood, reading it, exactly why an investigator might reach for a phrase that vague. I have needed one myself. I do not know if whatever happened to that group, and whatever happened to my own clients, 60 years and half a world apart, share any actual cause. I know only that the specific shape of the behavior, a sudden total certainty that the shelter itself no longer belongs to the person inside it, followed by flight into cold, that should have been unservable to even consider, appears to recur in isolated pockets across places and decades that have no reasonable connection to one another, and that no explanation I have ever given a client, a board of inquiry, or myself has fully accounted for why. I still guide winter expeditions. I want you to know that, because I think it matters more than anything frightening I have told you tonight. But I no longer tell my clients only the explanation that keeps them calm. I tell them the explanation, in full, standing at the same trailhead whiteboard I have always used. And then I tell them about Marcus Feld, and about the night in the basin with Priyanand, without softening either story for the sake of their comfort or my own. I watch their faces while I tell it, and I have learned to recognize the particular stillness that settles over a group once they understand that their guide does not actually have this fully explained, and I have come to believe that stillness serves them better than the easier confidence I used to offer instead. I ask them if they ever hear themselves thinking that the tent around them does not belong to them anymore, to say it out loud to whoever is nearest, immediately, before the thought has time to finish forming into a decision. I do not know if that instruction would have saved Marcus. I think about him often, on quiet nights in the back country, wondering whether a different sentence from me, at the exact right moment, might have kept him in his sleeping bag until morning, and I have had to learn to hold that wondering without letting it collapse into the kind of certainty that would either excuse me completely or condemn me completely, because I do not think either extreme is honest. I know it is the only honest thing I have left to offer anyone who chooses to follow me into that kind of cold, and I would rather give my clients an uncomfortable, unfinished truth than the same smooth, complete-sounding explanation that once sent a good man out into the snow in his socks, certain, for reasons neither he nor I have ever been able to fully name, that the only safe place left for him was somewhere else entirely. A quiet county outside Topeka, Kansas, a landscape of modest ranch houses and long, flat front yards, the kind of neighborhood where everyone notices a car that has not moved in 2 days. There is a recording that no longer exists, of a voice that might have explained everything, erased by someone who only meant to be helpful, and I have built my entire career around a single, simple rule meant to make sure that never happens again. I did not understand until this past spring that the rule itself could become its own kind of erasing. Good evening. I want to tell you about a case that is not mine, because it is the reason I do the work I do, and because I think you need to understand it before anything else in this story will make sense. In 1992, three women, a mother, her daughter, and her daughter's friend, vanished overnight from an occupied home in Missouri in the hours after a high school graduation. Nothing was taken. Their purses, their cars, their keys, their medication, even the family dog, all left exactly where they had been. There was no sign of a struggle beyond a single shattered porch-light globe, and there was a message on the home answering machine, blinking, waiting to be heard, that investigators later believed might have held a genuine clue to what happened that night. Before officials arrived to secure the house, a number of worried friends and neighbors had already let themselves in, waiting for news, tidying the kitchen out of nervous habit, washing coffee cups, emptying ashtrays, doing the small, kind, human things people do, while they wait for terrible news to either arrive or not. I have read the accounts of that morning more times than I can count. The driveway filling with cars that did not belong there, someone making a pot of coffee no one drank, someone else running a rag over countertops that had nothing on them worth cleaning. All of it done out of a desperate need to be useful in a house that had suddenly stopped making sense. Somewhere in that well-meaning disturbance, someone pressed the button on that answering machine, either to check it or to clear it, and the message was gone before a single investigator ever heard it. More than 30 years later, no one knows what those women, or that message, might have told the world, and the case remains, to this day, entirely unsolved. I have built my career around that case, though it happened in a different state, a different decade, to people I never knew. I am a crime scene preservation technician for a county sheriff's department in Kansas, and the entire discipline of my job, the thing I am paid to know better than almost anyone else in my department, is how to keep a scene exactly as it was found, how to prevent the small, human, well-intentioned disturbances that destroy evidence faster and more thoroughly than any deliberate act of sabotage ever could. It is quieter, more exacting work than people expect when I describe it. Mostly a discipline of restraint, of teaching myself and everyone around me to want to help less urgently than the moment demands. Because helping too quickly is so often exactly what ruins a scene beyond recovery. I teach a training module every year to new deputies on precisely this subject, and I always begin it with that erased Missouri answering machine message, because it is the single clearest example I know of how kindness, unchecked by procedure, can accidentally finish the work a criminal started. I did not always understand this lesson in the abstract. I understood it, first, the hard way, on one of my earliest calls. In my second year on the job, I responded to a welfare check on a young mother named Colette Ashby, whose sister had not been able to reach her for 2 days, and had grown worried enough to call the department directly. I was still junior enough that I was not first on scene, and by the time I arrived, several neighbors and a cousin of Colette's had already let themselves into the house through an unlocked back door, calling her name through empty rooms, growing more frightened with every minute that passed without an answer. I remember pulling up to that house and seeing the front door standing wide open, 3 or 4 cars already parked haphazardly along the curb, and understanding, even before I stepped out of my own vehicle, that whatever this scene had once been, it was no longer intact. When I walked in, I found a woman I did not know standing in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, having just wiped down the counter out of the same nervous habit that seems to overtake people in these moments. Unable to simply stand still in a house that felt wrong, she looked up at me with an expression somewhere between relief and apology, the particular look of someone who has just realized, too late, that being useful and being helpful are not always the same thing. On the counter beside her sat an answering machine, with its message light no longer blinking, which I did not think to question until much later, when it became clear that no one, in the panic and the tidying and the frightened waiting, had thought to preserve whatever had been on it before someone, in trying to be useful, had pressed the button that cleared it forever. I asked her, gently, whether she remembered pressing it, and she told me, with real distress in her voice, that she genuinely could not recall, that her hands had simply moved through the kitchen the way they always did when she was nervous, wiping, straightening, checking, and that she had no memory of the machine at all until I asked. Colette Ashby was never found. I do not know, to this day, whether that message would have told us anything at all, and I have spent a great deal of my career trying to make peace with the fact that I will never know, because the not knowing is now permanent, folded into the case file the same unanswerable way the Missouri message is folded into that far more famous one. I think about her sometimes on the anniversary of that call. A date I have never needed to write down because it has never once left me. And I wonder, in the particular unproductive way grief allows itself when there is no real resolution to reach for, whether she is still out there somewhere, or whether the message that vanished that day would have told us plainly that she never had the chance to be. I built the entire rest of my professional life around making certain that particular kind of loss never happened again on a scene I was responsible for. I became, over the years, the person in my department other deputies call when they need someone to keep a scene absolutely untouched, no matter how frightened or how well-meaning the people standing around its edges might be. I learned to arrive at a scene and become, almost immediately, the person sitting at its threshold telling grieving, frightened people that they could not go inside yet, that their instinct to help, however loving, was exactly the thing most likely to destroy whatever answer that house still had left to give. It is not a popular role. I have been shouted at, more than once, by people who could not understand why a stranger with a badge was keeping them from their own mother's kitchen. I remember one man, the grown son of a woman who had died alone in her home and gone unnoticed for several days, screaming at me from the edge of his own mother's yard because I would not let him retrieve a photograph album he insisted was the only thing he wanted, insisting I did not understand what it meant to lose a parent, and I remember standing there absorbing every word of it without moving from the doorway, because I understood, in that moment, exactly what a single careless step into that kitchen could cost the investigation into how she had actually died. I learned to absorb that anger without flinching, because I understood, better than almost anyone else in that moment, exactly what their kindness could cost. I want to tell you about the night that discipline nearly cost a woman her life instead of saving her. This past spring, I was dispatched to a welfare check at a house on the edge of the county, a modest ranch home belonging to a woman named Renata Cole, whose employer had called after she failed to show up to work for 3 consecutive days, without any explanation uncharacteristic for someone described as fastidiously reliable. Her supervisor had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Renata had seemed anxious in recent weeks, mentioning a coworker who had been overly attentive in ways she found unsettling, though nothing specific enough to report at the time. I remember that detail sitting oddly in my chest as I drove out to the address, a small, formless unease I could not yet attach to anything concrete. I arrived ahead of the responding deputy that evening, an ordinary staffing quirk rather than anything unusual, and I remember sitting in my car outside that house for a moment before approaching, doing what I always do at the start of any scene, assessing the whole picture before I let myself move a single step closer. The street was quiet in the particular, unremarkable way most streets in that county are quiet on a weekday evening. Sprinklers running 2 houses down, a dog barking once and then falling silent. Nothing about the neighborhood itself suggesting anything was wrong. Everything about that house told the same story the Missouri case had told 30 years earlier. The same story I had used so many times as a teaching example rather than a lived experience. Her car sat in the driveway, doors unlocked, purse visible on the passenger seat. The porch light was on despite the late afternoon sun, as though it had simply never been turned off since the night before. The mail had not been collected in what looked like several days. A small stack of it visible through the slot in the door. Catalogs and bills fanned out just inside the entryway. A pair of garden gloves sat abandoned on the porch step, beside a half-finished flower bed, as though she had set them down mid-task and simply never come back to finish. And through the front window, in the dim light of the front room, I could see the small, insistent blink of an answering machine's message light. On and off, patient in a way that felt, even from the driveway, like it was waiting specifically for me. I felt something move through me in that moment that I recognize now as the oldest and most familiar feeling in my professional life. A cold, focused certainty that this house was a scene to be preserved, rather than a home to be entered carelessly. And I want to be honest that this feeling, in that instant, felt exactly like competence. I radioed my dispatcher to confirm the responding deputy's arrival time. I did not attempt entry, and I stood at the edge of the driveway, doing precisely what my entire career has trained me to do best: waiting, watching, refusing to be the person whose careless disturbance destroys whatever this house still had to tell us. I remember standing there reaching for the small, ordinary thought that my coffee thermos was still sitting in my own car's cup holder, gone cold by now the way it always went cold on calls that ran longer than expected. A thought with no relevance at all to the house in front of me, one my mind offered up anyway, the way it always does. Some small solvable comfort to hold instead of the larger, wordless unease building steadily in my chest. I let myself think about that cold coffee for several seconds longer than I should have, watching the porch light glow uselessly against the late afternoon sun, listening to nothing at all coming from inside the house, and telling myself that nothing was exactly what I should expect to hear. It was in that waiting, standing very still at the edge of the driveway, with my hands cold inside my gloves, that I heard it. A sound from inside the house, faint, muffled, rhythmic, in a way that took me several seconds to fully identify as a human voice, and not simply a voice, but a voice speaking in a low, steady, pleading register that no recording, no answering machine, no piece of evidence waiting patiently to be preserved could ever produce on its own. I stood absolutely still for a moment, straining to be certain I was not simply hearing a radio left on somewhere inside, or a television, or the ordinary background noise of a house that only sounded occupied. And some part of me, I am ashamed to admit, almost hoped for exactly that explanation, because it would have let me keep standing exactly where I was, doing exactly what I had been trained to do. I want to tell you what happened in my body in the several seconds after I understood what I was actually hearing, because it is the center of everything I am telling you tonight. My mind, even as my ears registered a living voice in obvious distress, reached immediately for the training that had built my entire career. The reflex to wait, to preserve, to let the responding deputy take the lead on entry, while I documented the scene exactly as found. I felt my own feet remain planted at the edge of that driveway for a length of time I am still ashamed of, my hand still resting on my radio. Rather than moving toward the front door, some deeply grooved part of me insisting that the correct, disciplined, professional action was to wait for proper procedure rather than risk contaminating whatever this scene might still need to tell us. I could feel my own pulse in my throat, my vision narrowing until the porch and the front door were the only things left in it. And still some old, well-rehearsed instinct held my legs in place as surely as if someone had physically pinned them there. It was the sound of something breaking glass or wood. I could not tell which, followed by a single sharp cry that cut off far too abruptly, that finally moved my legs before my mind had fully caught up to the decision. I do not remember consciously deciding to run toward that house. I remember only that I was already at the front door, already testing the handle, already throwing my shoulder against it hard enough to feel it give at the frame, my body acting on an urgency that had apparently understood several full seconds before the rest of me did, that whatever evidence I might be disturbing mattered infinitely less than whatever was happening to the person still alive inside. I found Renata Cole in a back bedroom, bound with cord to a chair that had been knocked partway onto its side. A man I did not recognize standing over her with his hand raised. And I want to tell you that the next several seconds are less clear to me now than almost anything else in this story. A blur of shouting and radio calls, and my own body placing itself between them, in a way that had nothing to do with procedure, and everything to do with instinct, finally, at last, outrunning training. I remember the specific cold clarity of my own voice shouting for him to step back, a voice that did not sound entirely like my own, and I remember Renata's face turning toward me, wide-eyed, disbelieving, the particular look of someone who had stopped at some point in the preceding hours, expecting anyone to come at all. He fled through a back window before the responding deputy arrived less than 90 seconds later, close enough behind me that I heard the front door give way again, just as I finished cutting the cord from Renata's wrists with a folding knife I had never once, in years of careful scene preservation, expected to use for anything but documentation. Renata Cole survived. The man was identified and arrested within the week, a former co-worker who had, according to what she later told investigators, been fixated on her for months in ways she had not felt safe reporting, showing up at her apartment twice in the preceding weeks, under thin pretexts she had tried, quietly, to manage on her own, rather than risk being told she was overreacting. I have thought, more times than I can count since that night, about the specific length of time I stood at the edge of that driveway, radio in hand, waiting for procedure to catch up to a situation procedure was never actually built to answer. I do not believe, even now, that scene preservation is a foolish discipline, or that the lesson I learned from Colette Ashby's case was ever the wrong one. I believe, instead, that I had let a true and important rule calcify into something closer to an instinct of its own, one capable, in the wrong moment, of overriding the far more basic instinct that should always come first. That a living person in front of you matters more than any evidence that person might otherwise leave behind. I still teach that training module every year to new deputies, and I still begin it with the erased Missouri answering machine message, because I still believe it is the clearest lesson I know about what carelessness costs an investigation. But I have added a second story to that training now, about a blinking light I once stood outside of for too long, and about the exact sound a person makes when procedure has not yet given anyone permission to help them. I watch the new deputies' faces while I tell it, the particular stillness that settles over a room once they understand that even the most careful, well-trained person among them once let a rule stand between herself and a person calling for help. I tell every new deputy the same thing at the end of that lesson now, a rule that took me a very long time, and someone else's terror to fully learn. Preserve the scene when the scene is all that is left. The moment you hear a voice still inside it, you are no longer standing outside a scene at all. You are standing outside a person, and a person does not wait for procedure the way a message on a machine can. I visit Renata Cole occasionally, at her request, and we do not talk much about that night, though she once told me, months afterward, over coffee in the same kitchen, where the responding officers had once dusted for prints, that she had heard my footsteps on the porch before the door gave way, and that some small, desperate part of her had understood, in that moment, that whoever was coming had finally decided she mattered more than whatever they had been trained to protect first. I have carried that sentence with me since, turning it over the way you might turn over a stone worn smooth from handling. And I think it is, in the end, the only kind of evidence I actually want my career remembered for leaving behind. I found a small brass button in an attic once, in a house that was not mine, and I put it in my pocket, the way you might pocket a stone from a beach you liked. I did not think about it again for 11 days. On the 12th day, it was sitting on my own kitchen counter, and I had not carried it there. And I have not been able to throw it away since, because some part of me understands, finally, that it was never mine to keep or to lose. Good evening. I have sold 11 houses in Ashford, Connecticut over the last 6 years, and I want to tell you about the 12th, because it is the only one I think about anymore, and because I do not believe not fully that it is finished with me yet. I should tell you what I do for a living, because it matters more to this story than almost anything else in it. I am a real estate agent, and the actual work of that job, underneath the open houses and the paperwork, is convincing people to trust a feeling. A buyer does not fall in love with square footage. They fall in love with the particular slant of afternoon light across a kitchen island, with the idea of themselves at a certain age, standing in a certain doorway. And my job is to protect that feeling long enough for it to survive an inspection, a mortgage application, and the 1,000 small doubts that creep into anyone making the largest purchase of their life. I am good at this. I have spent 6 years learning to notice the exact moment a buyer's hesitation crosses over into fear, the particular way a shoulder drops or a voice flattens, and I have learned, just as thoroughly, 60 different soft and reasonable sentences to talk them back from that ledge before the fear can cost me a sale. I keep those sentences the way a surgeon keeps instruments, ready and specific, one for a strange smell in a basement, one for a crack in a foundation wall, one for the particular silence that falls over a young couple standing in a room that used to belong to someone else's grief. I have used every one of them so many times that they no longer feel rehearsed even to me. They feel like simple truth, delivered plainly, and that is precisely what makes them work. I did not understand, until this past year, that I had also spent 6 years learning to talk myself back from that same ledge, every single time it appeared, for exactly the same reason. The house at the center of this story sits on Larkspur Lane, a colonial built in 1931. The kind of property that sells itself on curb appeal before a single buyer ever crosses the threshold. White clapboard, black shutters, a wraparound porch shaded by 2 maples old enough to have outlived every family who ever lived beneath them. I was hired to list it last September by an estate attorney, handling the sale on behalf of a widow who had moved into assisted living and wanted the process handled quickly and quietly. Staging a house like that is straightforward work, mostly. You declutter, you depersonalize, you let the architecture do what it already knows how to do. I spent 3 afternoons in that house alone, clearing out an attic that had not been fully sorted in perhaps 20 years, boxing old holiday decorations and outgrown furniture for the estate sale company to collect. The attic itself was the kind you find in houses of that age, low along the eaves, warm and close in the September heat, smelling of cedar and old paper, and something fainter underneath that I could never quite name. I remember working alone up there for hours at a stretch with only the sound of my own movement and the occasional creak of the house cooling as the afternoon wore toward evening, a solitude I had never minded in any other house I had staged, and that felt, in that particular attic, oddly heavier than it should have. I told myself, more than once that afternoon, that the feeling was only fatigue, dust, the low ceiling pressing closer than my body wanted it to. It was on the second of those afternoons, kneeling in a corner of the attic, where the roofline sloped low enough that I had to duck, that I found a small tin box tucked behind a loose section of baseboard, the kind of hiding spot a house that age accumulates without anyone intending it. Inside the box was a single brass button, tarnished dark with age, the kind that might have come from an old coat or uniform, and folded beneath it, a single sheet of paper, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. I want to describe what was written on that paper carefully, because I have read it so many times since that I could recite it standing in front of you, and because I think the specific shape of it matters more than the general fright of it. The note began, as far as I could make out, with the words, "I have kept every one of them," though it did not say what every one of them referred to. It went on to describe the house in a way that felt less like a description and more like an inventory. The number of windows facing the street, the exact placement of the maple closest to the porch, the fact that the attic had been re-insulated in a particular decade, details a stranger would have no reason to know, and a homeowner would have no reason to write down for themselves. It ended with a single line that I did not understand the weight of until much later, though I felt something cold move through me the first time I read it, even without understanding why. The line read, "This house has never once belonged to the people who paid for it." I sat with that note in my lap for a long moment, in an attic already dim with the early dark of a September evening, and I felt the hair along my arms lift in a way I told myself immediately was only the temperature of an unheated attic in autumn. My mouth had gone dry sometime in the last few minutes without my noticing, and when I finally stood up to leave, my knees ached in a way that had less to do with kneeling on old floorboards than I wanted it to. I folded the note back into the tin, and I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because it is the entire center of this story. I put the tin box in my bag rather than in the estate sale pile, telling myself I would mention it to the attorney later. And then I did not mention it to the attorney later. Not that week. Not the week after. Not once, in fact, in the 4 months between finding it and the day the new owners signed their closing papers. I have turned that decision over more times than I can count, trying to find the version of it that makes me less responsible for what came after. And I have never found one. I did not withhold that note because I believed it meant nothing. I withheld it because the house had already generated 3 strong offers by the time I found it, because a young family named the Canes had already fallen in love with the particular slant of afternoon light across that kitchen island, and because I understood, professionally, instinctively, without needing to think the thought all the way through, that a stranger's handwritten claim of ownership tucked into an attic wall was exactly the kind of detail that could unravel a sale in a single conversation. I told myself it was an old joke, or a piece of amateur fiction, or the private eccentricity of some long-dead resident with too much time and too little to occupy it. I told myself this with the same fluent, practiced confidence I use on buyers, standing in a doorway, deciding whether they can picture their whole life inside it. And I believed myself completely, because believing myself completely has always been the thing I am best at. The Canes closed on the house in early October, a young couple with a toddler and a second child on the way, and I remember standing on that porch with them after the papers were signed, a paper cup of cider warm in my hands, the afternoon light doing exactly the thing it had always done best in that particular doorway. I remember watching the husband lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could reach the porch light switch for the first time, as if it belonged to her, both of them laughing, the whole scene so ordinary and so warm that it felt for a moment like proof that nothing in that house could possibly be wrong. I remember feeling, underneath my genuine happiness for them, one small, sharp thread of unease that I set aside deliberately. The way you might set aside a splinter you plan to deal with later, and then simply do not. And I remember finishing that cider down to the cold, sweet dregs at the bottom of the cup before I let myself drive away. Their first letter arrived 11 days after they moved in. Mrs. Kane called me about it rather than the police, because she did not yet understand it as a police matter, only as something strange enough that she wanted her agent's reassurance more than a stranger's report form. She read parts of it to me over the phone, her voice carefully level in the particular way people's voices go when they are working hard to keep them that way. The letter welcomed the family to Larkspur Lane. It referred to their daughter by name, though the family had only been in the house for a week and a half, and had not, as far as either of us could determine, mentioned her name to anyone outside their immediate circle. It described the exact shade the family had chosen for the nursery, a pale sage green they had only just finished painting 3 days earlier. It closed with a line that made Mrs. Kane's voice catch audibly on the phone. I have been patient with every family who has lived here. I trust you will understand why my patience always runs out eventually. I told her, in the voice I use for every hesitation a client brings me, that it was almost certainly a prank, a neighborhood kid, or someone who had attended the open house and overheard details they should not have repeated. I offered this explanation with total confidence, the same confidence I had used on myself in a September attic. And I want you to notice that I did not, in that moment, mention the tin box sitting in a drawer in my own home office, 40 minutes away, a box I had by then almost entirely stopped thinking about on purpose. I want to tell you that I looked into it, at least a little, in the days after that first call, because I think it matters that I am not pretending I did nothing at all. I asked a neighbor 2 doors down, an older man who had lived on Larkspur Lane for decades, whether he remembered anything unusual about the house, and he told me, in the mild, unbothered way people discuss local trivia, that the family before the widow had also mentioned strange mail once, years ago, though he could not recall any details, and did not seem to think it worth dwelling on. I took that answer and folded it into the same drawer as everything else I was choosing not to examine too closely, and I told myself I had done my diligence, when what I had actually done was gather one more piece of evidence, and decide again not to look directly at it. A second letter came 2 weeks later, and a third 2 weeks after that, each one slightly more specific than the last, each one referencing details of the family's routines that a passing stranger could not easily have gathered. The exact time the husband left for his commute, the fact that the toddler had started refusing to nap in her own room and slept instead in the master bedroom. I drove out to see them after the third letter, sat in their kitchen while Mrs. Kane made tea neither of us ended up drinking, and I watched her husband stand at the window every few minutes, not obviously, but often enough that I understood he had begun doing it without noticing himself do it. He asked me, carefully, whether previous owners of a house are ever legally required to disclose anything beyond structural issues, and I told him correctly that they were not, and I said it in a voice so even and so reasonable that I believed, in the moment, I was simply answering a question about real estate law rather than protecting a secret sitting 40 minutes away in my own desk drawer. By the fourth letter, which arrived the same week Mrs. Kane gave birth to their second child. The family had stopped sleeping through the night, had installed motion lights along the entire perimeter of the property, and had begun asking me, gently but insistently, whether I knew anything about the house's history that I had not already told them. I said no. I want you to sit with me in that word for a moment, because I have sat in it myself more times than I can count since. I looked a frightened young mother in the eye over coffee in her own kitchen, with a newborn asleep against her shoulder, and I told her no. I did not know anything more about the house than what was already in the public record, and I said it in the same warm, certain voice I have used to close 11 sales before this one, and it worked on her exactly, as well as it had always worked on everyone, including me. I want to tell you about the night I finally understood what I had actually done, because it is the part of this story I still do not fully know how to hold. It was late January, close to 11, at night, and I was working alone in my home office finishing paperwork on an unrelated listing. A mug of tea gone cold and forgotten at my elbow the way it always does when I lose track of an evening. The house around me was quiet. In the particular way houses go quiet, once every other light on the street has gone dark, and I remember noticing, without quite letting myself dwell on it, that I had checked the lock on my own front door twice already that evening, a habit I did not remember starting, and could not remember, that night, ever having done before this past winter. I had the tin box out, I want to admit, more often than I let myself acknowledge during those months, taking it from the drawer some nights simply to look at it, the way you might return to press on a bruise to confirm it still hurts. That night I had it open on the desk in front of me, the note unfolded beside it, when my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Kane, a single photograph and no caption at all. The photograph showed an envelope, addressed not to the Kane family, but to me by name at my home address, an address that appears on no listing flyer and no public document I have ever signed. She had found it, she explained in a second message, tucked into their own mailbox rather than hers, apparently placed there by mistake, or so she assumed, and she had opened it before realizing the name on the front was mine and not her own. I did not open the digital copy of that letter right away. I sat very still at my desk for a length of time I genuinely could not tell you afterward, my hand resting flat on the desk beside the tin box, feeling a tremor in my fingers I had not consciously produced, and could not immediately stop. My vision, I noticed distantly, had narrowed at its edges in a way that made the small circle of lamplight on my desk feel like the only lit place left in the world. Somewhere in that stillness, some small, useless part of my mind reached for an entirely unrelated worry. Whether I had remembered to lock the lockbox at an open house 2 days earlier, a thought with no relevance at all to what was actually happening, and I let myself sit inside that smaller worry for several seconds longer than I should have, because it was, for that brief window, so much easier to hold than the actual shape of what was arriving on my phone. When I finally reached for my phone to open the photograph in full, I found my thumb already unlocking the screen before I had consciously decided I was ready, the motion arriving a half-second ahead of any choice I remember making. When I finally opened the photograph and read it in full, the letter did not threaten me, not directly, not in any language a police report could easily act on. It thanked me, instead, in the same patient, formal handwriting as every other letter, for my discretion. It said, and I am going to tell you this as plainly as I can, because softening it would be its own kind of dishonesty, that a house remembers everyone who chooses silence on its behalf, and that I had been remembered, and that my own house, the one 40 minutes away with my own name on the deed, had windows too, and the writer had always been patient about windows. I do not know, even now, whether that letter was ever actually delivered by the same hand that wrote the others, or whether someone entirely unconnected to the case learned enough details from local gossip to imitate it convincingly. I want to be honest about that uncertainty, rather than resolve it falsely for the sake of a tidier ending. What I know is that I have not slept with my bedroom curtains open since that night, and that I checked the latch on my own attic access more often than I would like to admit to anyone who has not lived through something similar. I drove to the Kane's house the next morning before I had even fully decided to, still in the clothes I had slept in, if I slept at all. Mrs. Kane answered the door with a new baby against her shoulder, and something in my face must have told her before I said a single word, because she stepped back to let me in, without asking why I had come. I sat across from them at their kitchen table, the same table where I had once answered her husband's question about disclosure law, with such easy practiced confidence. And I told them everything. The tin box, the note. The 4 months I had spent believing that a stranger's claim scrawled on old paper was not worth the risk of losing their offer. I watched Mr. Kane's jaw tighten as I spoke, and I watched Mrs. Kane's face do something more complicated, something closer to relief than anger. As though 4 months of feeling quietly insane had finally been given a shape she could hold. My hands were shaking badly enough by the time I finished that she reached across the table and held them still herself. An act of kindness I did not feel I had earned, and have not stopped thinking about since. What I know is that the letters to their house stopped entirely the week after I told them the truth, as though whatever had been watching that family had only ever been waiting for exactly that disclosure, and had gotten, at last, precisely what it wanted. I still sell houses in Ashford, Connecticut. I want you to know that, because I think it matters more than any of the specific details I have given you tonight. But I have a rule now I did not have before last September, and it costs me sales, and I keep it anyway. If I find anything in a house I am staging, anything at all, a note, an old photograph, a stranger's belongings tucked somewhere they should not be, I disclose it before the first showing, regardless of what it might do to the price, or the timeline, or my own commission. I have lost 2 sales this year to buyers who walked away over details far more mundane than a tin box in an attic wall, one over a decades-old newspaper clipping about a small kitchen fire, another over nothing more than a strange smell in a crawl space that turned out, on inspection, to be entirely explainable. I have never once regretted either of those losses, the way I regret 4 months of a confident, well-practiced no. I think about the Kanes often, though we no longer speak the way we once did during those months. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the toddler sleeps in her own room again now, and that the family has planted a garden along the side yard where the motion lights used to be. I am glad for them in a way that still surprises me with how much it aches. I still have the button. I do not know why I have never been able to throw it away. though I have tried more than once, carrying it as far as the trash can at the end of my driveway, before turning back inside with it still closed in my fist. It sits now in a small dish on my own kitchen counter, in plain sight, where I pass it a dozen times a day, and some part of me has come to understand that keeping it visible, rather than hidden the way I once hid it, is the only kind of honesty this particular object has ever actually wanted from me. I do not know if a house can want anything. I know only that I spent 6 years believing my job was to protect a feeling long enough for it to survive the truth, and that somewhere in an attic in September, something patient enough to wait for decades finally found the one person in the entire chain who was already fluent in exactly that kind of protection, and simply asked her to keep protecting it a little while longer. I have a rule now, and I did not have it 2 years ago. If a house gives you a reason and a feeling at the same time, and they do not agree with each other, believe the feeling. I learned that rule from a farmhouse in Wisconsin, and from a case file 100 years old, and from a woman named Renata, who is not alive anymore, because I did not know the rule yet when it mattered. Good evening. I want to tell you about a case first, because you will need it before the story makes any sense, and because it is real, and because it is the reason I do the work I do, and the reason I very nearly do not do it anymore. In 1922, on an isolated farm in Bavaria called Hinterkaifeck, a family of 6 was found dead, killed with a mattock, a heavy farming tool meant for breaking ground rather than breaking people. In the weeks before it happened, the family reported the kind of small, explainable oddities that every old, isolated property produces. Footprints in fresh snow, leading from the tree line to the farmhouse, with no tracks leading back out again. A house key that went missing and was never found. Footsteps in the attic at night, investigated and dismissed, because searches turned up nothing each time. A newspaper on the property that no one in the family had bought, and no one delivering mail admitted to leaving. Every single one of these things has a boring explanation. A fox crossing its own trail, a key dropped in the snow, an old house settling under its own weight in the cold, a newspaper blown loose from somewhere down the road. The family chose the boring explanation every time, because the other explanation was that someone had been living on their property, watching them, for longer than any of them wanted to consider. After the murders, whoever did it did not leave. He stayed in that house with 6 bodies for 3 or 4 days, eating the family's food, feeding their cattle, using their fireplace, before finally walking away into a case that has never, in over a century, been solved. I keep a printed copy of the Hinterkaifeck case file in a drawer of my truck, not because I need to reference it, since I long ago memorized every detail, but because there is something steadying about having the whole terrible shape of it within reach. I have driven a great many miles of gravel road at night, with that folder sitting on the passenger seat, heater ticking, headlights finding nothing but corn stubble and fence posts for miles at a stretch. And there is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a truck cab on those drives, a quiet I have come to associate with the specific work of deciding whether I am about to walk into an ordinary old house or something else entirely. I have read every document that exists about that case more times than I can count, and I want to be honest with you about why. Because it matters for what happened to me. I did not study Hinterkaifeck out of some general love of true crime. I studied it because I am a person whose entire profession depends on choosing the boring explanation correctly almost every single time, and Hinterkaifeck is the one case I know of where the boring explanation was chosen every single time, and turned out catastrophically to be wrong. I should tell you, before I go further, that I live alone in a farmhouse of my own, one I bought young, and have been slowly restoring in the gaps between paying jobs for almost a decade now, and that there is an attic above my own bedroom I have not fully finished insulating, boards still exposed in places, old nail heads still catching the light of a flashlight, if you know where to look. I mention this only because it matters later, in a small way, the way certain facts about a person's life always turn out to matter more than they seem to at the time. I restore old farmhouses for a living. I have spent 19 years learning the difference between a house that is simply old and a house that is actually failing. And it is a skill that depends entirely on trusting explanations that sound reasonable over feelings that do not. A door that will not stay shut is not a warning. It is a frame that has shifted half an inch over a century, and I can prove it with a level and a tape measure in under 5 minutes. A sound in the walls at night is not a warning. It is mice, or a pipe cooling after the furnace cycles off, or a beam adjusting to the day's change in humidity. And I have been right about this so many thousands of times that being right about it stopped feeling like a guess years ago. It started feeling like knowledge. That confidence is the entire reason clients hire me, instead of someone less experienced. I have stood in 100 farmhouse hallways, with a client's hand gripping my forearm, while I pressed my palm flat against a wall, and told them, calmly, that the shudder they felt through the floor at 2 in the morning was only the well pump kicking on 2 rooms away. And I have been right often enough that clients have started calling that particular gesture of mine, palm flat against the wall, a kind of blessing. It is also, I now understand, the exact thing that made me the wrong person to be standing in a farmhouse outside of Blair, Wisconsin 2 years ago, when a woman named Renata Voss called me 3 separate times in 1 week to tell me something was wrong with the attic of the 19th century dairy farmhouse she had just bought to restore into a bed and breakfast. Renata was not an anxious person. I want you to understand that clearly, because it will matter later. She had gutted and restored 2 other properties before this one. She did not spook easily, and she did not call contractors to complain about noises, unless she had already ruled out every explanation she could think of on her own. She had bought the farmhouse in October, alone after her divorce, with the specific intention of turning it into a bed and breakfast by the following summer. And she told me once, in the driveway, that the empty rooms did not frighten her, that she found something almost restful in a house with nobody left in it but her. She had already picked out the paint for the guest rooms, By the time she called me the first time, a soft dove gray she had sourced from a mill in Minnesota, and she walked me through her plans for the wraparound porch with the particular unhurried pride of someone building the life she actually wanted for the first time in a long while. I remember standing in that kitchen with her in October, watching afternoon light fall across the bare wood floor, and thinking that of all the clients I had ever had, she was the last person I would have expected to be afraid of her own house. The first call came in early November, close to 11 at night, and I could hear the particular hollowness of an empty house behind her voice, the kind of echo a room gets once the furniture is gone and the curtains are down. She told me she kept hearing footsteps in the attic space above the north bedroom, late at night, slow and deliberate, one after another with an even, unhurried spacing, and that when she went up with a flashlight, there was nothing there, not even disturbed dust. I told her correctly that old farmhouse attics settle audibly in temperature swings, that the joists in a house that age can produce sounds that mimic footsteps almost perfectly, and that dust does not always show disturbance the way people expect it to, especially over old, uneven board flooring. She accepted this, and I could hear something in her exhale that sounded like relief. And I believed the explanation myself completely, because I had said some version of it to perhaps 30 other clients over the years, and been right every single time. In between the first and second calls, I drove past the end of her gravel road once, on my way back from a different job, and considered turning in. I remember sitting in the truck with the engine running, a thermos of coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder, telling myself there was no real reason to interrupt her evening over a sound that already had a perfectly good explanation. I drank the coffee cold rather than heat it back up, watched her porch light glow small and steady at the end of that long driveway, and drove on. It is a small, unremarkable memory, and I only tell you about it because it is the last entirely comfortable moment I can locate in this whole story. And I did not know, sitting there with cold coffee and a working heater, that I was spending the last of an ordinary kind of peace I would not get back. The second call came 4 days later. She told me a box of her grandmother's old letters, which she had stored in a locked linen closet on the second floor, had been moved, not stolen, simply relocated, sitting open on the floor of the hallway outside the closet the next morning, with the closet still locked. I told her, and I want you to notice how easily this came out of me, that old locks in farmhouses that age often have play in the mechanism that allows a door to swing open under its own weight if it is not fully latched, and that she had likely left it slightly ajar herself in the middle of packing and forgotten. This was, again, entirely plausible. I have seen that exact failure in at least a dozen properties. I did not go out to look at the lock myself. I gave her the boring explanation over the phone, the way you might reassure a friend, and she thanked me, and I remember feeling pleased with myself for having put her mind at ease so efficiently. I want to sit with you in that feeling for a moment, because it is the center of this whole story. Being good at reassuring people is not the same thing as being right. And for most of my career, those two things have overlapped so consistently that I stopped being able to tell them apart. The third call came 6 days after the first, late on a Tuesday night, and her voice was different in a way I did not let myself hear clearly enough at the time. So, well, She started and stopped, and I remember the particular thinness of her breath on the line, quick and shallow in a way I had not heard from her before. She said the dog would not go upstairs anymore, that he stood at the bottom of the staircase and would not climb it no matter how she coaxed him, something he had never done in the 8 months she had owned him. She said the attic access panel, which she had personally screwed shut after the second incident, had been unscrewed again, the 4 screws sitting in a neat row beside the opening, rather than scattered, as if someone had removed them carefully and set them down with intention rather than urgency. I felt something then, standing in my own kitchen with the phone against my ear, a small, cold drop along my forearms that I did not examine closely enough at the time to name. I remember, in the same breath as that feeling, wondering whether I had left my truck's tailgate down in the driveway, a thought that had nothing to do with anything Renata had just told me. An entirely mundane worry my mind reached for, instead of sitting even one more second inside what she had actually said. I do not think that was laziness. I think it was the same instinct that makes a person check a stove twice after hearing terrible news. The mind grasping for something small enough to be solved, while the actual thing sits too large to hold. I remember a pause on the line after she told me about the screws, a pause I filled almost immediately with an explanation about how dogs pick up on subtle changes in air pressure or scent that owners cannot detect, and about how a screwdriver bit can sometimes screws out on its own if a panel experiences enough vibration over time. An explanation I had never once given a client before, because it had never once been necessary. An explanation I built on the spot, because building explanations on the spot was, by then, simply what I did. She did not argue with me. She said okay, and thank you, and good night, in a voice that I have replayed in my head more times than any other voice I have ever heard, because underneath the politeness of it, I think she already understood that I was not actually helping her. I think she called me those 3 times not because she believed I could tell her something was truly wrong, but because some rational, hopeful part of her wanted permission to keep believing it was not. I did not hear from her again. I want to tell you about the 4 days that followed, because I have never been able to stop accounting for them. I did not call to check on her, because there was nothing, in my professional judgment, left to check on. I had, after all, already explained everything. I went about that week the way I go about every week, driving between job sites, pricing lumber, and somewhere in the back of my mind, distantly, I noticed that she had not texted to confirm our next appointment, and I did not think much of it, because clients go quiet between visits all the time. A neighbor doing a welfare check after Renata missed 2 consecutive mornings at the hardware store, where she had struck up a habit of buying her coffee, found her front door standing open, and called the sheriff's department. What they found in that farmhouse is not something I need to describe to you in detail, and I would not do that even if you asked me to. What matters for this story is that the man responsible had, according to the investigation that followed, been living in the unfinished portion of that attic for close to 3 weeks before anyone in Blair, Wisconsin, ever laid eyes on him, moving only when the house was empty or asleep, drinking from a rain barrel out back rather than risk running water at odd hours, eating food he had likely been stealing in small enough quantities from her own kitchen, that she had genuinely never noticed the difference. He was never caught. I want to say that plainly, without softening it, the way I have softened everything else in this story so far. The man who lived above Renata Voss for 3 weeks and then killed her has never been identified, arrested, or named in the 2 years since it happened, and the case remains, as far as the Trempealeau County Sheriff's Department will tell you, open. I drove out to the property once more, weeks later after the investigators had finished, and the house sat empty behind yellow tape, gone soft and sun-faded at the edges. I do not fully know why I went. I sat in my truck at the end of that long gravel driveway for a long while, the same spot where I had once sat with cold coffee and a working heater, and I found that my hands had gone still on the wheel, in a way that felt less like calm than like something had simply stopped transmitting. I did not go inside. I do not think I could have made my legs carry me up that porch, even if I had wanted them to. And I remember that realization landing in my body a full breath before I understood it in my mind. My foot already easing off the brake, the truck already rolling backward down the drive, before I had consciously decided to leave. I did not learn about Hinterkaifeck after this happened to Renata. I want to correct that assumption before you make it, because I made it about myself for a long time, and it was not true. I had already known about Hinterkaifeck for years, had already read the case files, had already understood, on some abstract academic level, that sometimes the boring explanation is a story a family tells itself, because the alternative is too large to hold. I knew the pattern before it happened to someone I actually cared about. I gave the pattern's exact same explanations anyway, in the exact same order. Footprints to settling, missing objects to loose hardware, sounds to pressure changes, because knowing a pattern intellectually and feeling its weight in your own chest at 11 at night on a phone call are two entirely different kinds of knowing, and only one of them changes what you do. I did not stop restoring farmhouses after Renata died, though I understand if that surprises you. I want to tell you why, because I think it is the part of this story that matters most, more than any sound in any attic. I did not stop because the work itself was never the problem. The problem was a version of me that had let being usually right become the same thing as being infallible, and had stopped listening for the specific, narrow category of moment where a client's fear and my explanation stopped matching each other cleanly. I have gone back to work, restoring old houses. And I still tell most clients, correctly, that their doors are simply old, and their attics simply breathe with the weather. But I have a rule now that I did not have before Renata called me 3 times in 1 week. If a person tells me something is wrong, and I feel even a fraction of a second of hesitation before I answer them, I go and look myself instead of reassuring them over the phone. I have gone and looked at 10 properties in the 2 years since, driven out in the middle of the night on nothing more than a hesitation, and every one of those 10 times I found exactly what I expected to find. An ordinary house doing ordinary old house things, insulation settled crooked, a raccoon nest in a soffit, nothing that needed more from me than a flashlight and 20 quiet minutes. I drove home each of those 10 nights a little embarrassed and a great deal relieved. And I want you to understand that the embarrassment never once stopped me from going back out the next time a client's voice caught wrong on the phone. The 11th time was this past winter, in a farmhouse 40 minutes from where Renata used to live, owned by a young couple who had called to say their infant monitor kept catching what sounded like a second, low-breathing pattern on the nights their daughter slept soundly through the whole night without stirring. I told them, on the phone, everything I would ordinarily tell a client, that baby monitors on older analog frequencies pick up interference from nearby appliances, that furnace blowers can produce a rhythmic, almost respiratory hum through old ductwork. I heard myself say it, and for the first time in 2 years I heard, underneath my own voice, Renata's voice thanking me the same way. And I told the couple I would come out that night, instead of waiting for morning. I drove out with my case file folder still in the drawer where I always keep it, though I did not open it, and I climbed into the attic access above the nursery, a little after midnight with a flashlight in one hand and my other hand pressed briefly, out of old habit, flat against the header beam, feeling for a shutter that would tell me it was only the furnace. The beam was still. The air in that attic held a smell I recognized immediately and did not want to. Something sour beneath the smell of old insulation, and the hair along my arms lifted before my mind had caught up to why. My light found a section of subfloor near the chimney chase that had been pulled loose and set back down imperfectly, food wrappers pressed flat into the gap between two joists, and a narrow, worn path through the insulation, packed down smooth and shining in a way that only repeated human weight over many nights could have made. My hands, I noticed a full second after the fact, were already reaching for the phone in my jacket pocket, dialing before I had consciously decided that this was the moment to stop looking and start calling. I called the sheriff that time. I did not explain anything away. I do not know, even now, whether what I found that night was connected in any way to Renata, or to the man who lived above her, or whether it was simply the same terrible, patient behavior finding a different house, because the pattern itself is more common than any of us want to believe. I have stopped needing that question answered in order to know what to do the next time a client hesitates on the phone the way Renata once did with me. I go and look. I would rather be wrong in front of a client, standing in an empty attic, with a flashlight and an apology ready, than be right in the specific, quiet way I was right 3 separate times in 1 week, 2 years ago, with a woman who is no longer alive to forgive me for it. I think about her, still, most often at the exact moment in a job when a homeowner tells me something small is wrong and I feel the old, comfortable explanation rising up in my throat before they have even finished the sentence. I let it rise. I do not always say it anymore. Some nights, driving home from a house that turned out, after all, to be simply old, I find myself grateful for how boring the truth was. Other nights, the ones I do not talk about as easily, I sit in my truck in an empty gravel driveway for a long while before I start the engine, thinking about a farmhouse outside of Blair, about 4 screws laid neatly in a row, about a dog that would not climb a staircase, and about how certain I once was that I already knew everything a house like that could possibly be trying to tell me. I went to see Renata's sister last spring, a woman named Colette who had moved to Eau Claire, and asked gently whether I would be willing to talk with her about those last 2 weeks. I told her everything I have told you tonight, all 3 calls, in order, without softening any of it, and I watched her listen the way I imagine I must have looked while Renata was talking to me, quiet, absorbing, searching each detail for the version of it that could still be explained away. When I finished, Colette did not tell me it was not my fault, which I had braced myself for and almost wanted, in the same way you sometimes want a wound cleaned, even though you know it will sting. She only asked whether I still did the work. I told her I did. She nodded and said that Renata had loved that farmhouse more than anything she owned, and that she hoped whoever lived there next would love it enough to actually listen to it. And I have carried that sentence with me since. Turning it over the way you turn over a stone that has worn smooth from handling. I still drive past the end of that gravel road sometimes, on my way to other jobs, though I no longer stop the way I once did, with a thermos of coffee going cold in the cup holder. A different family owns the property now, and from the road their porch light looks the same small and steady yellow that hers once did. And I have never once let myself wonder, standing at that intersection with my blinker ticking, whether that particular light is warning or simply light. I think if I let myself wonder that, I would never be able to drive past it again. I finished the insulation above my own bedroom this winter. Finally, after nearly 10 years of leaving it half done. And I want to tell you honestly that I did not do it because the cold bothered me, though it had bothered me plenty of winters before this one. I did it because I had spent one too many nights lying beneath those exposed boards, listening to the ordinary creak of my own old house settling around me, and had caught myself, for the first time in my life, unable to fully believe my own explanation. I lay there telling myself it was only the temperature dropping, only the joists adjusting the way joists always adjust. And some small, newly honest part of me answered back that I did not actually know that. Not the way I used to know it, not with the flat, comfortable certainty that had once made me good at this work, and had once made me the wrong person for a woman named Renata Voss to call 3 times in 1 week. I finished that attic myself, every board, every seam of insulation, checking each one twice, not because I believed anything was living above me, but because I never wanted to lie in the dark again and realize I had chosen the boring explanation simply because it was the one that let me go back to sleep. There is a rule I have followed for 11 years of ocean crossings, and it has never once failed me, and it failed someone I loved anyway, because a rule can be correct and still not be enough. I tell every new crew the same thing before we ever leave the dock. The boat is almost always safer than the water. I have never once told them what it cost me to still believe that. Good evening. I want to tell you about a rule before I tell you about a crossing, because you will need the rule first, and because it has organized my entire adult life. In open ocean sailing, the single most dangerous decision a sailor can make is abandoning a fundamentally sound vessel. More sailors have died in life rafts and lifeboats, launched in panic from boats that were still floating, still afloat, and still statistically safer than the water around them, than have ever died from the actual sinking they were fleeing. A hull hold below the waterline can often still be managed. A boat taking on water can often still be pumped, patched, or simply outlasted until help arrives. A small rubber raft, alone in the open ocean, has almost none of those advantages. No real shelter from exposure. No reliable way to signal a passing ship. Nothing between its occupants and a sea that does not care how frightened they are. And yet panic does not consult statistics. Panic tells a frightened person to get off the thing that feels wrong and onto anything else immediately. And that impulse, more often than storms or collisions or any other single cause, is what kills experienced sailors on otherwise survivable crossings. I think often in this line of work about a ship that never fit that pattern cleanly, and that has haunted maritime history for over a century and a half precisely because it does not. In 1872, a fully provisioned merchant vessel called the Mary Celeste was found drifting near the Azores, entirely seaworthy, her cargo intact. 6 months of food and water still aboard, the crew's own belongings undisturbed in their quarters. Only the lifeboat was missing, along with the 10 people who had sailed on her, a captain known for his sobriety and competence, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and a hand-picked crew of experienced seamen. No trace of struggle, no evidence of piracy. Nothing to explain why 10 capable people would choose the open Atlantic over a ship that, by every measure available to investigators then or since, appears to have been the safer place to stay. I do not know what convinced that crew to leave their vessel that day, and after 11 years of ocean crossings, I have come to believe that not knowing is the most honest response the case has ever deserved. I have delivered private yachts across the Atlantic for owners for 11 years, sailing vessels too valuable or too far from home for their owners to sail themselves. And the rule I teach every crew member before we ever leave the dock is the same rule that has kept me alive through storms that have sunk boats far sturdier than some I have crossed in. The boat is almost always safer than the water. I say it plainly, the same way every time, standing at the dock with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a new crew member's nervous eyes on me, because I need it to become instinct before it is ever tested, and because I have learned the hardest way a person can learn something. Exactly what happens when that instinct arrives a few seconds too late in someone else's chest instead of my own. 6 years ago, I was delivering a 44-foot sloop from Newport to the Azores with a single crewmate, a man named Desmond Cray, experienced enough that I had trusted him on 2 previous crossings, without a moment's concern. He was the kind of sailor who made a captain's job easier rather than harder, quick with a line, unbothered by long, uneventful watches, the sort of quiet competence that lets you sleep soundly on your own off hours because you trust the person holding the helm behind you. We had crossed together twice before without incident, and I remember feeling, in the days before that third departure, the particular ease of working with someone whose instincts I had already learned to read. We hit weather 2 days out that neither of us had expected, a fast-moving system that turned a manageable swell into something considerably more violent by midnight, waves breaking over the deck hard enough to knock us both off our feet more than once. The boat took on water, more than I liked, though well within what our pumps could handle, and I remember shouting the numbers to Desmond over the wind, telling him plainly that we were fine, that the boat was doing exactly what it was built to do, that the worst thing either of us could do was leave it. He did not believe me. I want to be honest that I understood, even in the moment, why he did not. Because the boat in that storm did not feel safe, not even to me. And feeling safe and being safe have never once been the same thing on open water. I could see it happening to him in real time. The particular way fear replaces judgment in a person's face. his eyes fixed on the water coming over the rail, rather than on the instruments that would have told him, plainly, that we were still well within the boat's limits. Sometime after 2 in the morning, in a lull between the worst of the swells, he told me he could not stay aboard, that something about the boat felt wrong beneath his feet in a way he could not explain, and, before I could reach him across the pitching deck, he had released our life raft and gone over the side with it, into water black enough that I lost sight of him within seconds. I remember screaming his name into wind that swallowed it whole, my hands already reaching for a line I had no time to throw, my body understanding, a full breath before my mind could accept it, that I was no longer going to be able to stop what had already happened. I stayed with the boat. I want to tell you plainly that I did exactly what my own rule demanded of me. Hailing the Coast Guard, marking coordinates, pumping water for the rest of that night, with hands so cold I could not feel my own fingers by morning. I remember the specific, terrible discipline it took to keep working the pumps, rather than simply standing at the rail scanning black water for a shape that never resolved into anything. And I remember telling myself, over and over, in the same voice I used on every frightened crew member since, that the correct thing to do was exactly what I was already doing. The storm broke by dawn. The boat, holed but entirely manageable, carried me the rest of the way to the Azores 3 days later, under my own power, exactly as intact as my training had always told me it would be. Desmond Cray was never found. The search continued for 11 days before it was called off, and I have never, in the 6 years since, stopped hearing the specific sound his voice made, telling me the boat felt wrong. A sound I understood, even as I heard it, as fear rather than fact, and a sound that turned out, in the most literal sense, to have been correct about nothing except the one thing that mattered most to him in that moment. I did not stop delivering boats after that crossing, though I understand if that surprises you. I want to tell you why, because it is the part of this story that matters more than any single storm. I did not stop because the rule had failed. The boat, in the end, had been exactly as safe as I promised Desmond it would be. What haunted me was not the rule's failure, but its success. The unbearable fact that being entirely right about a boat's seaworthiness had not been enough to save a person who could not make his own fear believe it. I flew back to the mainland after the Azores hearing, and drove to Desmond's mother's house myself, rather than let her hear the details secondhand from an insurance adjuster or a Coast Guard liaison. I sat in her kitchen for the better part of an afternoon, answering every question she asked as plainly as I could. And I remember her asking me, near the end, whether the boat had truly been safe the whole time, the way I had told her son it would be. I told her yes, because it was true, and I watched that truth land on her exactly as unhelpfully as it had always felt in my own chest. A correct answer that explained everything about the boat, and nothing at all about why her son was gone. I want to tell you about the crossing this past autumn, because it is the one that finally taught me the difference between a rule and a promise. I was delivering a 52-foot catch from Bermuda to the Azores for its owner, a quiet, careful man named Elliot Hayne, who had sailed enough coastal water to be competent but had never once crossed open ocean, and who had specifically requested, in our first conversation, that I teach him everything I could about the crossing, rather than simply carry him through it as cargo. I liked him for that request, and I liked him more over our first 4 days at sea. Watching him learn the boat's rhythms with a careful, humble attention that reminded me, more than I wanted it to, of Desmond in his better moments. He kept a small notebook in the cockpit and wrote down everything I told him: wind patterns, sail trim, the particular sound a halyard makes when it needs tightening. And I remember thinking, more than once during those first 4 days, that he was exactly the kind of crew member who made this work worth continuing to do. We fell into an easy rhythm together, trading watches, sharing meals in the cockpit, while the boat carried us steadily eastward. And I found myself, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, actually enjoying a crossing rather than simply enduring it. On our fourth night, we sat up late trading stories about other boats we had known, and I told him, in a lighter voice than I usually use for it, about the Mary Celeste, the old ghost ship legend every sailor eventually hears somewhere along their career. A fully sound vessel found empty near these very waters, with no explanation anyone has ever settled on. He listened to the whole thing with a particular attentiveness of someone filing it away rather than merely being entertained, and I remember him asking, quietly, whether I thought the crew had been right to leave. I told him no, the same way I tell everyone, that whatever frightened them, the ship itself gave them no reason documented anywhere in the record, and that leaving it was almost certainly the single choice responsible for whatever became of them. On our fifth night out, close enough to the Azores that I could feel the crossing's end approaching in the particular restless way sailors feel a landfall before instruments confirm it, the wind died entirely, leaving us becalmed on a sea so flat and so silent that the absence of motion itself began to feel unnatural. I remember standing at the helm with a mug of tea gone cold in my hand, the water around us so still it barely reflected the stars, the boat's sails hanging slack and useless overhead in a way that felt, after 5 days of steady wind, almost like a held breath. I remember thinking, with no weight to the thought at all, that I had never once, in 11 years of crossings, experienced a calm quite this complete, and I remember foolishly finding something almost peaceful in it, sipping cold tea, and watching the stars sit undisturbed on water that refused to move. Elliot found me a little after midnight, his voice low in a register I recognized immediately. The same careful, formal unease I had heard from Desmond 6 years before he went over the side. He told me the boat felt wrong beneath his feet, that something about its motion, or its stillness, had changed in a way he could not name, and that he did not think he could go back below deck to sleep. He apologized even as he said it, the way people do when they suspect their own fear will not be taken seriously, and I remember him glancing back toward the companionway, as though something down there had followed him up onto the deck. I felt something move through me in that moment that I am not fully able to describe even now, a cold recognition that arrived in my chest a full breath, before my training could organize itself into words, my mouth going dry, the hair along my arms lifting despite the mild, windless night around us. I gave him the rule, the same rule I have given every crew member for 11 years. The boat is almost always safer than the water. And I watched him nod the way people nod when they want to believe you more than they actually do. The exact way Desmond had once nodded at me in a storm that killed him anyway. I did not let the moment end there this time. I want you to understand that this is the only thing I did differently, and it is the only thing that mattered. I told Elliot to hold the helm, and I went below myself, not to reassure him with words alone, but to actually look, hands on the hull, at whatever his fear was responding to, because I finally understood, 6 years too late for Desmond, that a rule recited from the cockpit is not the same thing as a rule verified with your own hands. I moved through the cabin with a flashlight, checking each fitting the way I had been trained to, methodically, refusing to let the strange, held-breath stillness of that becalmed night rush me past anything. My own footsteps sounded too loud in the silence, the boat's usual creaks and knocks absent, in a way that made the cabin feel less like a familiar space and more like something waiting to be examined. I felt my chest tighten with every step deeper into the hull, a narrowing, focused attention that had nothing to do with fear of the supernatural and everything to do with the specific, professional dread of finding something real. I found in the bilge a slow, steady weep of water along a through-hull fitting that our instruments had not yet flagged. A genuine failure, small but real. Exactly the kind of problem the boat could absolutely survive with proper attention, and exactly the kind of problem that would have killed us both if I had simply repeated my rule from the cockpit and gone back to admiring the stars. I knelt there for a long moment, with my hand pressed flat against the wet, cold hull, feeling the specific, unmistakable give of a fitting that had begun to fail hours, maybe a full day, before either of us had consciously noticed anything wrong. And I understood, kneeling in that narrow, dim space, exactly how close Elliot's unnamed fear had actually come to naming something true. I spent the next 2 hours making the repair myself while Elliot held our course, working by flashlight in a space barely large enough to kneel in, my hands steady in a way I was quietly grateful for given everything running underneath them. I told him the truth the entire time over the intercom, calling up through the open hatch, that his instinct had been pointing at something real, and that the rule I had given him was still correct. The boat was still safer than the water, but only because someone had gone and checked. I could hear the relief in his voice each time he answered. Not the relief of a fear dismissed, but the relief of a fear finally taken seriously enough to be resolved. We reached the Azores 2 days later without further incident, motoring the last several hours in flat, easy water under a sky finally beginning to lighten with the promise of landfall. Elliot shook my hand at the dock in Horta with a kind of gratitude I have not entirely known what to do with since, thanking me not for the crossing itself, but for the 2 hours I had spent kneeling in a dark bilge, taking his fears seriously enough to go looking for its cause. I think about Desmond every single time I say that rule to a new crew member now, and I have changed the way I teach it, though I have not changed the rule itself, because the rule was never wrong. What I tell every crew member now, after 11 years and 1 crossing, that finally taught me the whole of it, is this. The boat is almost always safer than the water, and it is the person standing at the helm's responsibility to go and confirm that, with their own hands, every single time someone tells you it does not feel that way. I did not check quickly enough 6 years ago to give Desmond a reason to believe me instead of his own fear. I do not know if a faster answer would have saved him, I know only that I will never again let a true rule stand in for an actual physical act of looking, and I think of everything the ocean has ever taught me. That is the lesson I would trade almost anything to have learned before it cost me what it did.